The morning for Paris always started the same way. Early rise and as soon as possible to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for the kids. The kids slept lightly and often got up before their mother could get to the cooker. "Mom, what are we going to eat today?" the oldest, one Gregory, asked. Paris smiled. "What would you like?" The boy hesitated. "Well, I'd like some pancakes with Patrick, with raspberry jam." At the same moment, from the neighboring bedroom came the disgruntled voice of a 5-year-old. "No way. Olivia and I want pancakes, and not with jam, but with sour cream, or at least jam." "No, we had pancakes last time and the time before that. We always have to give in to those girls," Gregory persisted. Soon Olivia joined the fray and immediately stood up for her sister. Paris shook her head. This happened almost every morning. No, she wasn't upset, of course not at all. The kids were such a joy to Paris, their cheerful bickering was like the sweetest music. And the young mother also knew that not even half an hour would pass, as the children will make peace and stop arguing about who and what to cook for breakfast. Paris tried not to offend anyone. She made pancakes for the boys and pancakes for the girls. In fact, there was nothing complicated about it. It just took a little longer to cook. And when Paris finished cooking breakfast, there was a truce between the kids that lasted until the next morning. The kids had no problem with appetite. The sisters would sneak pancakes from their brothers and exchange them for pancakes, which always made their mother smile. The same happened with jam and sour cream. They argue and argue, but they eat it themselves. Looking at them lovingly, Paris thought. There was never a dull moment in the Pedersen family home. The sisters and brothers often arranged such mobile games that the rooms became a mess. The children knew that before they had to go to bed for their afternoon nap, they had to put all their toys in baskets and put the house in order. This did not mean that Paris was a strict mother. Not at all. She loved her children and never neglected them. The neighbors were puzzled by the young neighbor who, in their opinion, had hied herself down with 4 children. No, well, I understand, of course, cannot have their own. So she took a baby from an orphanage. Well, you could have taken custody of them, couldn't you? Or at least adopt a couple. But here are 4 at once. Mrs. Vanessa Pete, a neighbor, who had been married before her marriage and had wanted to change her surname since she was a child, was puzzled. Eventually she succeeded, of course, thanks to a swift affair with a successful businessman. But she still remained a simpleton at heart, so called her at school in the literal and figurative sense of the word. Since the rich husband from the first days of their life together surrounded Vanessa luxury and wealth, she had absolutely no need to work. She spent her time with her best friend Randy, sitting in the kitchen with a martini or something stronger. They'd pick a fight with everyone they could think of. But it was Paris who was most often the victim of their malicious gossip. Why did she take 4 kids out of the orphanage? Was it for the money? So she could get an allowance, Randy asked. Vanessa frowned, then said, "Who knows this Paris? They say she's childless. I mean, she can't carry a baby." So she and her husband decided to adopt a boy, and then they got another one. Then where's he disappearing to? Why is Paris always alone? I wish I could get a glimpse of that husband. Vanessa shook her head. I guess he couldn't stand the conditions of a large family. He divorced and took a mistress. It is understandable to pull so many children on himself. I can't get in the mood for one. And now I've got 4. Don't tell me, mate. She should live for herself. And she's all about other people's kids, Randy was obliging. And while the 2 inseparable women were criticizing Paris, she was taking care of her children as she conjourna, treating them as her own. She didn't blame Samuel. Why should she? He'd left the family. What can you do? That's life. He made his own choices. I mean, he swore he loved Paris and the kids. But in the end, he chose a relationship without commitment or morals. It's okay. I'll be fine. We'll find a way. There are allowances and part-time jobs, Paris reassured herself. Being a good self-taught seamstress, she took orders for sewing clothes and never disappointed her customers. Many of the customers thought that Paris had golden hands, but she herself did not think so and worked at low prices, embarrassed by the fact that she had to survive on such part-time jobs. For these purposes, Paris allocated herself a separate room in which stood a sewing machine and a table with all sorts of devices for sewing. Best of all, Paris got evening dresses or for everyday wear. All of them were beautiful and attracted the eye. Even her neighbor, Mrs. Vanessa Pete, had to admit that Paris was a real talent. 3 months ago, she had ordered an evening gown that had cost her a penny. Having come in it to dinner with her husband's business partners, Vanessa conquered everyone with her femininity and beauty. Many thought that she bought it in an expensive boutique or tailored to order from a famous couturier. But Vanessa, only smiling enigmatically, mentally calculating the money saved, and Paris was just doing her favorite thing, getting from this incomparable pleasure. "Mom, what are you going to sew today?" Kate asked after breakfast. Paris looked at her daughter with a smile. "Today I'll be cutting a pleated skirt, and tomorrow I'll probably start sewing," Kate thought dreamily. "And you will sew me a beautiful dress for school." "True, I'm only 5 years old, but you have to prepare in advance." "Of course, my dear. But you're thinking about it too soon, my dear. You'll grow up in 2 or 3 years and the dress will be too small. It's better to have it made just before you go to school," Mom said with a smile from behind her sister's back. Then a head with pigtails appeared. "Mom, not the dress. Don't forget, Kate's only 5. I'm 6. And I'm going to school before her," exclaimed Olivia. Soon the boys joined in the conversation and began to encourage the sisters to get involved in another game of Indians and Cowboys. The Cowboys, of course, were Gregory and Patrick. Kate and Olivia were their opponents. When Paris asked why the balance of forces was this way and not the other way round, she heard from Gregory a quite reasonable answer. "Mammy, but Indians have long hair, just like Kate and Olivia." The young mom shook her head. "Okay, guys, play whatever you want, but keep it down, please. Don't blow up the house. I've got work to do, and don't go out in the yard unless you have to. It's very chilly today." After listening to their mother, the children talked happily and moved smoothly into the next room, where a real battle soon broke out. Well, Paris got to work, finishing the skirt. The order was for a wealthy client, who promised to give her an extra bonus if she liked it. Paris herself wasn't trying to do it for the bonus at all. In fact, she enjoyed doing something special, something that gave her moral pleasure, working with expensive fabric. Paris couldn't help but think about Samuel, who had been so cruel to her when he had left her for another woman about a year ago. Everything had been going so well before that. Paris grew up in a poor family, where money was always in short supply, and her parents struggled to feed their 5 children. Being the oldest, she learned very early to cook and help her mother with everything. By high school, Paris knew the recipes for many dishes, which she got just fine. Perhaps if it weren't for her passion for sewing, she would have become a great cook. Borscht and soups, and all kinds of salads, Paris was easy and simple. "Daughter, you have a real talent. If you want, I can help you get a job as a kitchen assistant in the school canteen," Mom once suggested to Paris. Perhaps if she had stayed in her hometown after school, things would have gone very differently in her life. But she made her choice and decided to try her luck in the metropolis. At first, everything was going very well. She entered the university on a correspondence course, thinking to connect her life with design. Then she rented a small room on the outskirts and got a job as a waitress in a small restaurant. She liked the job in general, a reasonable schedule, a lot of new acquaintances and earnings, thanks to which she could not only take care of herself, but also send money to her parents. By that time, her father had been disabled as a result of a car accident. As a bus driver, Mr. Andrew had a near head-on collision with a drunken SUV driver who swerved into the oncoming traffic lane. Of course, Paris' dad tried to avoid the collision, but it was very difficult to do so. The impact was so strong that Mr. Andrew was intentionally squeezed in the cabin, from which rescuers had to extract his body with hydraulic shears. The fractured spine, coupled with chest trauma, left his father in a wheelchair. Doctors did everything they could to save Mr. Andrew, but no one could keep him from becoming disabled after such an injury. All of this left an unhealed wound in Paris's heart. It was then that she first questioned the rightness of her choice. Maybe she should have stayed in her hometown and taken care of her family and her sick dad with her mom. For several weeks, Paris agonized over the unsolvable dilemma, after which she decided to stay in the metropolis. It was during this crucial period that she met Samuel, who worked in a car service and had already been in a marriage that was unsuccessful. However, as well as all that he subsequently took on, Surrounding Paris with attention and care, Samuel quickly achieved her location and reciprocal feelings. The guy had big plans. I just need a chance to get one. Save up some money and start my own business. Then I'd be in full swing, he said. Due to her naivety, Paris took everything at face value and saw only good things in her fiancé. But Samuel had his own plans. Having made Paris a marriage proposal, he forced her to take a leave of absence from the university and direct all her energies into work. It was thanks to the hard labor of the girl Samuel managed not only to buy a small house in the suburbs, but also to start a small business based on the resale of scarce car parts. Paris believed, hoped, and waited for the moment when life would change for the better. But time passed, and the prosperity in her family was still not. Not only that, attempts to conceive children did not bring any results. Unfortunately, the pregnancy was terminated every time Paris saw the coveted 2 stripes on the test. That's when Samuel suggested she get a foster child, or better yet, 2. Honey, is that really what you want? I'd love to, Paris asked, trying not to notice the tears forming in the corners of her eyes. Samuel smiled. Well, of course you would love. I think about it day and night all the time. Just think of the horizons we'll have when our sons are old enough to help me in the motor trade. Imagine the life we'll have then. Paris's face lit up with joy, tears of happiness rolling down her cheeks. She didn't know then that Samuel was deceiving her, thinking only of the child's benefits. And while Paris loved children with all her heart, her husband saw them only as an opportunity to make easy money and receive new benefits to make his own worthless life easier. First, they adopted Gregory and Patrick. The next were the girls Olivia and Kate, who filled Paris's heart with boundless joy and love. But Samuel was indifferent to the appearance of children, thinking only about how to get a car from the local fund for their own needs. Unfortunately, the true face of her husband Paris learnt only when he left her for a young mistress and moved to live in a luxury mansion. At first there were tears, tantrums, realization of her own stupidity, and then all this was replaced by pride that she was a mother of 4 children, whom she loved with all her heart. And it is not a problem that the house needs repair, and money is always short, not in them happiness, as they say. Having directed all her love and attention to the upbringing of children, Paris was completely disappointed in her ex-husband. Although she did not hold a grudge against him, he did not deserve to spend so much energy and inner energy on him. The only thing she was grateful for was that Samuel had made her feel like a real mom, biological or adopted. What did it matter? What mattered was that the children felt warm and affectionate, and the rest would work out someday. Paris was brought out of her agonizing musings by the voice of her eldest son, Gregory. "Mom, there's a woman standing on the doorstep." I looked through the crack, and there she was on the porch. She's holding a file of papers. Paris raised an eyebrow in surprise, then got up from the table and headed for the door. The young mother's heart was ready to jump out of her chest with excitement. The last time people with daddies like this in their hands had come to see her was about 3 months ago, and the conversation turned out to be very nervous and unpleasant, because the visitors turned out to be employees of the Fund for Social Protection and Guardianship. And what if they came again? Trying to calm her inner trembling, Paris cautiously opened the door and saw an elegantly dressed woman of about 45 with a leather folder in her hands. "Mrs. Paris Pattison." Instead of greeting, the stranger began. "Yes, that's me. What can I do for you?" The woman grinned, then said, "Well, for starters, let me inside, please. I'm a social welfare officer. 3 months ago, you already had colleagues with an inspection, and then you persuaded them not to take away your custody rights. But now the situation has changed dramatically." Paris had gone pale, and the corners of her eyes were wrinkled. "Come in, of course. What do you mean the situation's changed? The boys and I are fine, and we don't need any help." "Look, honey, it's not up to you to decide whether you need help or not. You say you live well, and you don't need anything. But your house is in a state of disrepair. When do you intend to renovate it? When your daughters get married?" began rather abruptly. Paris's cheeks immediately flushed with shame and tears came to her eyes. "I'll do the renovations, but not this summer, probably in the autumn. Believe me, I've got it all worked out. By September, I will be able to save up enough money to change the wallpaper and the windows." The care worker looked at the landlady with irony. "Do you really think so?" "It's a lie, pure and simple. Look at the conditions in which you live. Also, do you intend to be a single mother? When you change your marital status, you probably think your children dreamed of having a family where daddy is just a memory. Mark my words. I'll give you a month to make a difference. If not, we'll be forced to raise the issue of child removal." Pauline's heart literally burst from pity for the kids and the despair that gripped her. What is this? They lived, and now everything will go to ruin. In the meantime, the guest went round room by room. She did not hesitate to look even in the refrigerator, whether the children are not hungry, not lacking in money and clothes. But Paulina's fridge was in good order. Homemade milk, eggs, cottage cheese, all bought at the market and from people from the village, as well as a full pot of fresh soup. Second, third, Paulina loved to spoil her children and never saved money to buy food. But despite this, the care worker was still not satisfied and left Paulina's house with her head held high. "Yes, and I remind you again, you have exactly 1 month. And if nothing changes, you will not see your children as your own ears." Paulina's mood was completely ruined. How could there be cutting and sewing when her heart was literally bursting with sadness and longing? Kneeling down in the hallway, Pauline covered her eyes with her hands and quietly cried. "Mammy, why are you crying? Did that ant hurt you? If you just tell us, we'll never let her on the doorstep again," Gregory asked gently. Paris looked up at her son with tearful eyes. "And you, man," she smiled. "Thank you, my protectors. What would I have done without you?" "Hooray! Mom is smiling again," Kate exclaimed and hurried to hug her. Surrounding Pauline, the children began to dance round and sing songs, intending to lift her spirits. How could she not smile? "Nothing, I'll manage. I just need to save up a little money. Or maybe I could borrow some money to start renovations," Paris thought, and began to go through in her mind those who could help her in the bedroom. Her ex-husband's candidacy was discarded at once. After the divorce, Samuel did not give the boys a penny, believing that he should not help other people's children. Paris did not argue, thereby putting a cross on the former spouse. Of course, she could turn to her parents, but where would they get the money? Dad's health was deteriorating every day, and the younger brothers are about to graduate. What about Mrs. Vanessa Pete next door? She doesn't seem to be short on funds, especially since I'm sure to pay her back in a month or two. I'll be processing several orders a day, Paris reasoned. It was definitely a sensible idea, and she knew it as well as anyone. But when Paris appeared on the doorstep of Mrs. Pete's house, her surprise knew no bounds. She wondered what she wanted. This beggar, did she have any orders to propose, ran through the mind of the businessman's wife. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pete. I apologize for this unexpected visit. You see, I have a favor to ask of you," Paris began with her eyes downcast and embarrassed. "A favor? What kind of a favor? Do we have something in common?" the hostess asked, shifting from foot to foot. The guest briefly recounted her morning conversation with the child welfare officer. Vanessa thought for a moment, and then immediately replied, "Well, I don't have that kind of money. I can lend you a couple of $100 or $300, but no more than that." At that moment, Paris felt a shame she had never known before. "Oh my God, am I turning into a beggar?" ran through the unhappy woman's mind. Thanking her neighbor for her attention, Paris returned home. As it was nearing dinner time, her little guard was probably hungry. After feeding them, Paris put them to bed and decided to take advantage of her free moment to go shopping. She couldn't afford to go with the whole bunch, as the children were so excited that they started throwing everything off the shelves, not realizing that they wouldn't have enough money to buy all those items. After waiting until everyone was asleep, Paris dressed quickly and slipped out of the house quietly. She knew that she now had 2 hours of free time to do what she had planned. Even though it was early summer on the calendar, the weather outside was overcast and cool. Heading toward the familiar supermarket, Paris involuntarily added a step to keep warm. The few passers-by looked anxiously at the sky, expecting rain, but Paris had a feeling that there would be no precipitation today. It wasn't because she'd looked at the weather forecast this morning. It was just that, in her opinion, The rain couldn't last indefinitely, so she knew that sooner or later the sun would give its caress and warmth. But no sooner had Paris approached the shop than she witnessed a very strange scene unfolding right in front of her eyes. And it all began with the fact that from the building of the supermarket came out of two firmly beaten young men in the uniform of security guards. Under their arms they led a man in his 30s, followed by 3 young children. The stranger's eyes were filled with pain and the realization of his own helplessness. "Please don't touch our daddy, please," begged the children, clinging to the sleeves of the guards' jackets. "Tom, look how cleverly he's set himself up, hiring a whole bunch of street kids and forcing them to beg. He's kind of clean himself. He ain't got nothing to do. Daddy he pretends to be," one of the guards snarled. "Let me go, for God's sake. They're not a gang, they're my sons. They're triplets. But they're not twins, you understand." The man hissed as he tried to break free of the man's grip. It is hard to say what would have happened to the father of 3 children further, if at that very moment a huge white dog, who had been sitting idly at the entrance to the shop, had not intervened. Growling furiously, he moved towards the guards, intending to grab one of them by the ankle. "What are you doing, you brute?" "Well, get out of here before you get gassed with the canister," the guard shouted, but the dog didn't seem to be bothered by the guard's protective equipment. When the 4-legged help came to them, the kids squealed with joy. Since the guards had to choose the lesser of 2 evils, they decided to let the man go and return to the shop building. "Yay, Daddy's been released," screamed the kids and started jumping around him like little jumpers, and only one of them stood a little apart, watching the reaction of his brothers. At the sight of this cheerful picture, Paris could not hold back a smile. All little children are like each other. After all, always so around them, only good mood, she thought, and came closer. The young father hugged his sons in turn and looked at the shop building with obvious dislike. It was obvious from the expression on his face that he was still processing what had happened. Paris knew at once that he would not appear in this place again. The snow-white dog, who, along with the boys, hovered around the tall, broad-shouldered man, was worth a word of praise. And Paris was also sure that if the boy's father wanted to put up an active resistance, it would not be easy to calm him down. On some inner impulse, she stepped closer and asked quietly, "Excuse me, can I help you?" The stranger shuddered and shook his head, looking at her carefully. At that moment, the dog standing next to him yapped as if judging his master's answer. The man turned his gaze back to Paris and then asked, "Can I help you? Maybe you can help me rent a place for a while, but not too expensive. We're from Fort Ross, maybe you've heard of it." Even though it was the first time she'd heard the name, she nodded and thought about it. It would be difficult for newcomers, even with small children, to live in a big city, especially since he didn't seem to have much money. "I'm not sure about renting, but if you need to live in the city for a while, I can offer you my house. I have 4 kids, though. Would that be okay?" Hearing Paris's answer, the man smiled happily. "You're still asking. I'd sleep in a dog box if I had to. You see, we need a place to live. I thought I could sort out my problems in a day. I can see you can't do it in a week." "Oh, come on, you can say that too. My name is Paris, by the way. So can I use your name? I don't live too far from here. I'm just going to make a quick run to the shop. You wait here, okay?" He gave Paris a grateful look and added, "And I am John Sure, no problem. But I'm not going back into that shop." "Okay, I'll be right back. Would you like to buy a bone for such a big dog?" John shrugged uncertainly. "I don't know what to say." But Paris had already interpreted his reaction as mute agreement and hurried to the door. She couldn't waste time, for the children would wake up any minute now and cry when they didn't find their beloved mother around. Having bought all the necessary things, Paris remembered about the bone on the way out and came back. Is it worth saying how much joy was in the eyes of the dog at the sight of such a treat? "Thank you. It's true. I've never been to a city this big with my kids. I've been a hard worker since I was a kid. I worked as a tractor driver, did well for the farmer John started on the road to Paris House." "What brings you to town? Did you want to work for a living or something else?" John shook his head sadly. What was it? Desperation, of course, and a desire to help my son. He's got a heart defect. 3 months ago, no one would have suspected such a thing, and now it's happened. The baby's mother died, God rest her soul. I'm the only one left. Paris looked at her companion with undisguised respect. It was the first time she had ever seen such dedication. Especially among men she had stopped trusting. But she didn't want to put up an impregnable wall of alienation or distrust in front of John this kind. Strong man told it like it was, without concealment. He didn't play games like her ex-husband Samuel. What happened in the shop? Why did the guards get mad at you? Paris asked, breaking the long pause. John wrinkled his nose. They wanted to accuse me. My kids have never been in a shop like that. They've never been to a shop like this in the village. But here there are so many sweets that it's dizzying. The little one's eyes went wild. They put one candy in their pockets, then another. I, a fool, didn't see it. Do my sons realize what's going on? 5 years old, so the guards came over. Word by word, they started accusing me of stealing, saying I'm teaching my kids to steal on purpose. Stealing. That's a laugh. Paris nodded sympathetically. That's why I shop alone most of the time. And my tomboys, even though they're not from the country, but when they see something, they always buy, even if they don't have any money. No, we won't do it again, Auntie. If we had known that Daddy would be in trouble because of us, we wouldn't have gone near those sweets at any price, came from a child's voice. Thanks for Dick's help, too. Otherwise we'd have been in a lot of trouble, said one of the little brothers, still hiding behind his parent. Yes, he's a good dog. Did you bring him with you from the village? Paris asked with undisguised admiration. No, he joined us at the railway station. He's a clever dog. I'll give him that. Just not a street dog. He must have run away from somewhere, or maybe his owner got rid of him himself. And not a sure thing, though. He's got a collar, and there's a tag with his name and his owner's phone number. Dick is a great dog, John explained. When he heard his nickname, the dog immediately perked up his ears and wagged his tail. Maybe we should find his owner. You mean call him? Paris said timidly. John shook his head. I can't find a landlord. I'd have to find a place to live first. I've been on my feet for 2 days already. I need to get to the clinic to make an appointment for Nick. He's been acting up, but it's not a quick job. You know how it is. Paris preferred to remain tactfully silent, realizing that the young father's situation was more than difficult. The big city was extremely hostile to strangers, making them realize one simple truth. A guest is good, but home is better. Soon Paris's house came into view. She looked anxiously at Dick, wondering where she could put him. Don't you worry, he's easygoing. If anything happens, I can calm him down in no time. You won't even blink an eye, John said, catching Paris's eye. She smiled. This young tractor driver was strong and confident, capable of overcoming any obstacle. Not like Samuel, who had to be followed for a week before he could hammer a nail into a wall. When she reached the door, Paris fumbled in her pocket, trying to find the key. Finally, when it was found, she inserted it with great care into the keyhole and turned it counterclockwise twice. In the back of her mind, Paris hoped the little ones were still asleep and didn't want to wake them up early. But as soon as the door opened, Gregory and Patrick burst into the hallway. Hey girls, Mum's here, come and meet her. Soon there was a loud stomping of little feet and Kate and Olivia came running into the room. Oh, Mummy's not alone, but with guests. Gregory looked at the 3 boys' age in surprise. Yes, son. Meet our guests, Nick, Ben and Ivan, and this is their daddy, Uncle John, said Paris with a smile. Wow, a real Uncle John. They should have a cat and a dog, Gregory exclaimed excitedly. Well, I can't promise a cat, but we have a dog. Look in the yard and see that handsome boy over there. His name is Dick, John said in a rich baritone voice. He did not have to say it twice, and soon all the children were outside in a noisy bunch. The awkwardness caused by the scene of acquaintance disappeared at once, and in 5 minutes the kids were treating each other as if they had known each other for many years. Children are children. What can you take away from that? Paris and John moved smoothly into the kitchen, where they began to sort out the shopping. Seeing that the doors on the cupboards were holding on by sheer force, the guest immediately asked for a screwdriver and some time to repair them. "Come on, why don't you eat first? After all, it's a long drive," Paris suggested. "Well, dinner's a good thing, sure, but I'll be done in no time. What's the point of wasting time? Besides, I can't help you with the cooking, I assure you. Anything I cook, it'll burn, or it won't be cooked. And if I start with soup, it's bound to be too salty." Paris smiled. "How have you been cooking for the kids all this time?" John was embarrassed and scratched the top of his head with his mighty hand. "How did you cook?" "It was very simple. A grandmother helped me, out of the goodness of her heart. She looked after the kids while I was working in the fields. You know what kind of machinery we had? It was always breaking down. 1 day in the field, 2 days for repair. That's the battle for the harvest." While talking to Paris, John managed to screw 3 cupboard doors in the kitchen. "What about the farmer? Didn't he give you any new parts? It's in his interest, too," Paris asked again. "What's the farmer? He just wants to get what he can out of the hectare. He doesn't care how you do it. I paid for the most scarce spare parts out of my own pocket. What else could you do? When you have to work, it's not the Stone Age civilization. You should see my tractor. It's a beauty, I tell you. Painted blue, replaced the rubber with new ones. It's a beast of a machine." There was a note of nostalgia in John's voice. Without wanting to, he retold Paris all his past, which was inextricably linked with the village. "I'm actually an orphan. They found me in a big box at the walls of the orphanage. You know, the fruit kind. And there's a set of spare nappies, a mirror, all the usual stuff. And there's a note at the bottom saying, 'Don't judge, kind people. Help me in any way you can.' Yes, they called me Banana in the orphanage until the 5th grade. But then they stopped calling me Banana when I started fighting back. I stuttered a lot. The teachers didn't know what to do, and then a technician came to work with us. She said that she had spent several years in a women's colony, and in the past she was a teacher with experience. I think her husband put her there too. This woman got rid of my stuttering once and for all. She had a special method. I've been grateful to her all my life," John continued. "Where is she now, stirring the soup in the pot?" asked Paris. John sighed sadly. "Yes, she died. She lived the rest of her life alone. She wanted to adopt me. But she didn't. She'd lost her health in the penal colony. She was a weak little thing. But before she died, she bequeathed me a house in a village. It was her family nest. So after the orphanage, I settled there and got married. But God gave me little family happiness. My wife lived only 2 years. She gave birth to 3 children without a cesarean. Everything seemed to be fine. Internal hemorrhage was overlooked. What can I say now?" Of course, John's story stirred up a storm of feelings and emotions in Paris. She'd thought all along that she'd been unlucky in life. But that's just the way it is. You never know what's in store for you. Luckily, dinner was ready, and Paris and John had to take their minds off their sad thoughts to get all the children around the table. They carried it out into the hall, which was instantly filled with the smell of fragrant, freshly cooked food. John and Paris, on the other hand, sat off to the side, using a small nightstand as a table. "Wow, Mama, are we always going to have lunch and dinner together now?" Gregory asked excitedly. "Oh no, now there will be more of you, and Mom won't have time to make us pancakes," Kate said firmly. Paris looked meaningfully at John and smiled embarrassedly. "But don't worry, daughter, you'll have pancakes and pancakes. Let the guests come to their senses." "Can we keep Dick? He is so good. Honestly, he doesn't bite and likes to play," asked one of the children. "But his tongue is too wet." "But that's okay. We'll be fine." And we also agreed that each of us will leave a portion of our lunch after dinner. That way we'd all have enough to eat and Dick would get some, Gregory suggested. Her son's words brought tears to Paris' eyes. How could a child at such a young age think of such serious matters? It's mind-boggling. A child prodigy, no other way. John suddenly looked at Paris with a different look, and if before there was genuine interest in him, now there was respect and sincere sympathy. At that moment, a very interesting thought occurred to Paris, but she didn't want to discuss it in front of the children, so she waited until John had eaten and gestured for him to go out into the yard. The joyful Dick immediately rushed towards them, trying to lick his nose or cheek. Come on. We had a deal. No tenderness. And now you're at it again." John waved him off jokingly. The dog froze and looked into his master's eyes with devotion. Of course, John wasn't his real owner. But on the other hand, when he was on the street, the dog had picked him out of the mass of passers-by by some unerringly accurate instinct. Not only had he chosen him, but he'd defended him, protecting not only John himself, but his sons as well. "He's a good man, isn't he?" "I've been thinking. I want you to stay with me as long as you need. I don't need any money, but I need your help in return." Paris started out embarrassed. "Help? What is it? What about the kids? Or something?" John became alarmed. "No, the kids are fine. It's just something else. They could take them away from me. They're from the orphanage, you know. I'm all alone. There's no one else but me. My husband left me. Child Services is threatening to take them back to the orphanage, and they're threatening to take away my custody rights." John shook his head sadly and began to rub his fingertips, as he always did in moments of special inner turmoil and discomfort. "What can I do to help? Don't think I'm not refusing. Just tell me exactly what I need to do." Paris had a hard time admitting it. You could see it in her pale cheeks and trembling lips. "Become my husband. I mean, it's not real. It's fake. I need it for reference. The commission will come, and my marital status has changed. Let them try to touch me. I won't give up my kids. They've become my family. And that's it. If you don't help, someone else will, but don't refuse to help. I'm not asking for my own sake. Do you understand?" The young tractor driver thought for a moment. Of course, John realized that he could not refuse this nice woman who was ready to do anything for the sake of 4 orphans who had become her relatives. But wasn't he like that himself? Wasn't he willing to do anything to save his own sons? Loving parents are always the same, and it does not matter where they are at that moment, in the city or in the village, all the same. As long as the children were healthy and well-fed, and the rest will surely come. John gave his answer almost immediately and paused only for the sake of propriety. "I'll do it, Paris, I'll do it. You just tell me how and what you want me to do, and I'll do my part." "Thank you, John, you're a lifesaver. If it wasn't for you, I'd be going crazy right now. It's easy to talk about a sham marriage and all that, but who'd want me with 4 kids? Even in a fake marriage, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who wanted to marry you," Paris said with feeling. As if to confirm her words, Dick barked loudly and wagged his tail. From the outside, it seemed that the dog had long ago approved of their future marriage and was ready to sign them here and now. It was not clear whether he intended to do it with his tail or his paw, but Paris and John did not care about that question. They spent the rest of the evening sitting on the porch and chatting. There were kids frolicking in the house. Even Nick, who was always pale, was lively and playful. Overhead, the stars burned, twinkling as if they intended to blind anyone who tried to question their beauty. The wind had died down, and the air was noticeably warmer, which spoke in favor of the weather changing for the better. "That's so nice now. I would sit like this and watch it until the morning. It brings back memories of the countryside, peace and quiet. The smell of fresh-cut grass, and cicadas and crickets singing in the bushes, and the moon is big and close by. Reach out your hand, and it's already yours," John said dreamily. Paris looked at her guest with a smile and furtively touched the fingers of his heavy male hand, which could not only operate complex mechanisms, but also caress her favorite children. They sat outside until about midnight, and then went inside the house. The children had already scattered to their sleeping places, and, covered with their bedspreads, were quietly dozing. Those who had beds that were wide enough for them lay down in twos. Some, on the other hand, slept alone, like Nick, who needed more attention and peace. John slept on an old cot set up in the living room. Because of his tall stature, there wasn't enough room for him, so he had to twist from side to side most of the night. In the morning, John got up before anyone else and went to the water pipe in the yard to take a cold dip, as was his custom. Dick was already there. Having met his master with a mighty onslaught of his paws, he washed his face, wasted no time, and began to make minor repairs in the yard. He mended the shriveled fence, carried firewood into the shed, and split a dozen logs that Paris would never have been able to overcome. At the same time, Mrs. Vanessa Pete was watching them closely from the neighbor's house. Look at that. Has that mother of many children got herself a new boyfriend? Why are they all going to her? Is it honey, or what? Mrs. Pete thought with a chuckle. Of course, Paris didn't know all this. She got up with the cockerel and started to prepare breakfast, as was her habit. John had done a great deal by this time. His skillful hands were doing a good job, as was evident from the result, which was not long in coming. You're a master. You haven't been in the house for 24 hours and you've already fixed everything, Paris said with a smile. John just waved her off. Come on, it's no big deal. It's just a little thing. It was just a little help around the house and it wasn't heroic. At breakfast, Paris explained where the clinic was. You take this bus, you go 3 stops, and you're there. Don't get it wrong, or you'll be traveling round in circles. Well, Ben and Ivan are going to stay with us for a while, Paris said. John smiled gratefully and touched Paris's arm. The other day they were going to go to the registry office, so that the guardianship service would not have any claims against a mother with many children. But first John intended to solve the issue of treatment of Nick, who was still feeling very bad. Wishing him luck, Paris walked them to the gate, and embarrassed by her own revelation, put the sign of the cross on them. In the meantime, the rest of the children went out into the courtyard, where the sun was already shining. They broke into groups and, to Dick's great joy, began to play ball and Cossack robbers in turn. The dog galloped about, yapping and wagging his tail. At one point, wanting to pet his panting friend, Gregory came close to him and began to stroke his withers and scratch behind his ears. Dick grunted softly in pleasure as he put his contented face to the sun. Suddenly, the boy's fingers fumbled for a small rubber button on his collar. "Oh, what the hell is that?" Gregory whispered, and then he pressed the little button, which was hidden by the outer surface of the collar. Immediately afterwards, a red light on Dick's neck flashed with surprising regularity and frequency. "Wow, you've got a beacon here, like a real policeman," Gregory exclaimed happily. He was about to tell his mum about his find when he was drawn back into the game. Paris began to clean the house, as the fun of the 7 children was not conducive to keeping it in order. 2 hours passed like a flash, and then an excited Gregory came running into the house and announced, "Mum, there's a lot of cars at the gate. Big ones, just like in the films. And someone's smoking, and the gate creaks. Can you imagine?" Paris automatically corrected the headscarf on her head and on stiff legs went to the gate. When she opened the gate, Paris froze in amazement. In front of her house stood a motorcade of SUVs, and then out of one of them stepped a solid man, in whom it was easy to guess a successful businessman or official. At the same time, Dick broke through Paris's back and found himself on the street. "Well, hello, my boy. How did you get here, hugging the dog?" exclaimed the stranger, seeing the genuine joy of the dog. Paris smiled embarrassedly, as if in some inexplicable way she had been involved in his disappearance. In a rather friendly tone, the guest approached Paris and, barely containing his excitement, said, "Thank you very much. Where did you find him?" "My men were scrambling around looking for that rascal. I didn't actually find him. A man brought Dick to me. He's not here right now, though. He went to a private clinic with his son," Paris replied. At that moment, the ubiquitous Ben appeared from behind Paris and immediately added, "Uncle, we found Dick at the station. He came up to Daddy and started petting him. So we picked him up and brought him to Aunt Paris." The man played with his jowls for a second or two, and then he said, "Dick had a beacon in his collar, but you only had to press a button to activate the transmitter. The beacon wasn't always on. Then when the dog went missing, somebody turned it off. But this morning the signal came back on. That's how we found you." Paris smiled, then turned her gaze to the little ones playing. One of them must have accidentally activated the beacon, which had helped us find the real owner. As it turned out, he was a successful businessman, Mr. Daniel Smith, who owned a chain of car dealerships and petrol stations in the city. It was said that in the past he had serious problems with the law, as a result of which he even had to serve time in prison. But now he was quite a respectable man who was actively engaged in charity work, giving a considerable part of his income to orphanages and shelters for the underprivileged. "Would you at least like to have tea with us?" Paris asked quietly. Mr. Smith paused for a moment, then gave a nod to the security team. "Go ahead, spread out in the cafes for a bite to eat while I sort it out myself." The main thing was that the dog had been found, and the rest was just petty stuff. Soon Mr. Smith was already sitting in the kitchen, surrounded by 6 children who looked at the businessman as if he were a foreign wonder. "What a big family you have," said the businessman with a smile. Paris' cheeks blushed. "We have 2 families here at once, 4 of my children and 3 of John's, my guests." Mr. Smith took a sip of hot tea and added in a low voice, "My family is a mess. I have a daughter, of course, but I don't expect to have an heir. Speaking of children, a fiance has recently appeared. We're getting married." Paris nodded in agreement and was about to turn the conversation to another direction when the businessman took out a common photo of his daughter and son-in-law from his inner pocket. "They make a handsome couple, that's for sure. It's a pity that the son-in-law doesn't like money. He has an aversion to luxury." Paris took the photograph in her hands and almost lost her senses from shock. My God, could such a thing be possible? Mr. Smith looked at the lady of the house in surprise. "Have you met my daughter or son-in-law?" Paris's cheeks flushed with shame. Of course she knew Samuel since she had been married to him for several years. After all, he'd abandoned Paris at the most difficult time in her life, leaving her alone with 4 young children in her arms. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she began to tell the businessman her sad story. As the expression on Mr. Smith's face changed, it was clear that nothing good was in Samuel's immediate future. What a scoundrel, a liar, swearing he'd never been married, and in fact deceiving me from the start, clenched his fists and grumbled to the businessman. "I'm sorry to have upset you. I really didn't do it on purpose," Paris muttered. At that moment, the front door opened and John appeared on the doorstep, holding Nick, who was exhausted and peacefully dozing in his father's arms. Mr. Smith looked at his guest and then, breathing convulsively and heavily, reached for his tie. "What's the matter with you? Are you ill?" Paris asked anxiously. The businessman shook his head absent-mindedly, then grimaced as if with a toothache. "No, I'm fine." "It's just a vision, I guess," Mr. Smith whispered, and then he added, "That bloke looks a lot like my dead father. He looks just like him." John carefully put Nick to bed and then went back to the kitchen. As it happened, he had heard a snippet of the conversation, so he was quick to disappoint the businessman in his assumptions. "No, sir, I don't have any relatives. I grew up in an orphanage, in a fruit crate. I was found as a baby under the door of an orphanage. That's just the way it is," John said. "Now, how did you put it, my good man?" "In a fruit crate?" the businessman interrogated. "Well, yes, I'm telling it like it is. What's there to hide when it's just the way it was?" John replied in surprise. Mr. Smith stood up abruptly from the table and clutched his head. "Now I've had my wages for my sinful deeds. Lord, is this how it is in life? It's Iris. When I was first convicted, she put you in an orphanage. She was a drunk afterwards, wasn't she? She kept bringing up that fruit crate." John looked at his guest with undisguised irritation. "Is he crazy? What kind of son am I to him? He looks like a successful businessman, and now he's out of his mind." But Mr. Smith had no intention of giving up so easily. Instead, he began to tell a long story about how, when he was a young man, he had a favorite girlfriend, Iris, who became pregnant just before he was arrested and then imprisoned. Am I supposed to believe all this? There aren't many desperate mothers who bring their children to the door of an orphanage in a fit of grief, John replied irritably. In his heart, he hadn't believed in such miracles for a long time. Yesterday, he was a village tractor driver, and today he was the son of a millionaire. Why not a minister? What's the big deal? But Mr. Smith could be persuasive, and he didn't rest until John agreed to have his DNA analyst. All right, I'll do your DNA. Just calm down. You're wasting your money. Good sir, I'm not your son. They don't drop millionaire sons like kittens at the door of an orphanage in a fruit crate, said John. Paris gently took John's hand. Calm down, don't worry so much. Take the test and live in peace. To Mr. Smith's credit, regardless of the results of the DNA test, he was committed to paying for Nick's operation. What am I saving? You guys have saved me a lot more money than that, especially you in Paris. If it wasn't for your information, I'd be calling Samuel my son-in-law in a week, and Dick's been found again. I won't take him away from you, though. Let him enjoy his kids. Then I'll find him a bride and get a puppy for myself. Paris looked at the businessman and could not believe her eyes. Can there really be such kind people in the world? Wasn't it all a dream? She would open her eyes now, and everything would disappear like a morning mist. But of course it didn't disappear. It had become clearer and clearer, filled with the power of color and shape. John, despite all his skepticism, turned out to be Mr. Smith's illegitimate son, which pleased both of them immensely. Paris's ex-husband, Samuel, got the punishment he deserved from the quick-tempered businessman. After all, he was the one who'd taken Dick out of town and got rid of the stubborn Paris, preventing him from winning the hearts of rich beauties. To the surprise of many, no one laid a finger on him for that. Instead, Samuel became an outcast who had no place in his hometown. John, as promised, married Paris, but now it was a real marriage, not a sham, and the feeling of mutual attraction was so strong that no one could prevent it. Nick had an operation, and now he was quickly moving towards recovery. Dick stayed in John's family, and for this he had a very good reason. 7 young children with the prospect of a possible addition. Could a dog dream of more? Who knows, who knows? The husband and his mistress were already rubbing their hands together, but they had no idea how their wife would teach them a lesson. Kira, as long as she could remember, had always dreamed of warmth, care, and attention. All this she lacked since early childhood. Kira's mom died of a heart attack when the girl was about 5 years old. Doctors warned Adelaide about the risks, but the woman still decided to give birth. For the first few years of her life, Kira was the most loved child in the world. She vaguely remembered those times: warm hugs, her mother's gentle words, and kind smiles. But of course, Kira couldn't remember the details. Mom's face was lost in the fog. The meaning of her phrases slipped away. Then Kira was left alone with her father, a sullen and taciturn man. He fulfilled his parental duties faithfully, fed his daughter, bought her clothes, even checked her lessons. But any heart-to-heart talks were out of the question. Her father asked only specific questions about her grades at school, her health, her plans for vacations. Sometimes he wondered if someone was hurting his daughter. That was all. Kira didn't know, couldn't remember if Dad had always been so unsociable, or if he had been so changed by the death of his beloved woman. From neighbors, Kira had heard more than once that her father loved her mother very much, long sought the favor of a modest beauty, and then, when Elsa married him, fulfilled her every wish. Kira was hard to imagine her eternally dissatisfied with something father so romantic, in love, attentive. Becoming older, the girl understood the father blames his daughter for the death of her spouse, accidentally overhearing his conversation with a neighbor. The men were standing in the stairwell, and Kira was just returning from school. The anniversary of Mom's passing was approaching. That's probably why the neighbors, longtime pals, had struck up this conversation. I told her to get an abortion, Dad said quietly. And she wouldn't have it. Let it be, she said. She had a feeling it would end well. Kira, hearing these words, froze under the stairs. She just couldn't go up now and make her presence known. Well, that's how it ended up being okay at first, Uncle Vince, the neighbor, pointed out. Kira knew her mom was friends with his wife and Aunt Elsa. Kira was born. Adelaide still had a whole 5 years to live afterward. That's so sad, Dad agreed. But her health deteriorated. I could see it right away. She got worse. And then there were those sleepless nights. You know, I tried to get up myself to see my daughter so Adelaide could rest, but I couldn't be there all the time. Those bastards, They finished her off after 5 years. That's for sure. Even the doctor confirmed it. Kira took it hard. She hadn't discussed it with anyone. And who would she tell? Her father, as it turned out, considers her the culprit of all his misfortunes. That's why he probably doesn't talk to his daughter much. Kira didn't have any grandmothers. Or rather, there was one dad's mom, but she lived far away in the village. They saw each other very rarely, and of course warm, trusting relations between them did not arise. And girlfriends. What about girlfriends? You can't talk to them about such topics, they won't understand. They're just fine. Everyone has a mom and a dad. Not everyone has a mom and a dad. But mom's the main one. How many tears were shed into the pillow in her childhood, teenage years, longing for a mother the girl hardly knew or remembered. Sadness over the cool and strained relationship with her father. Kira dreamed of growing up sooner, having a family of her own, having children. She had no doubt that sooner or later a man would appear in her life who would love and protect her. And Kira would become happiness for him, a source of energy and inspiration. Her father probably loved her in his own way, took care of his daughter as best he could, worried about her future. It was her father who arranged for the girl to go to the University of Economics and Law, and even to the prestigious Faculty of Finance and Economics, and made some connections. And now his daughter, who would hardly have entered on general grounds, is a student of the best university in the city. No, Kira was not stupid or lazy. She always studied well at school and diligently did her homework. But just to enter this faculty required quite outstanding abilities. The girl didn't have them, so her father helped her. True, among Kira's classmates, as it soon turned out, outstanding abilities possessed few. So many then got into the university in this way either for money or by blat. Kira liked studying, and with classmates somehow immediately formed a warm, friendly relationship. A wonderful student time began. Life had changed a lot. Kira felt that very soon she would become an adult and independent. That means that her dream of a loving family is very close. In the 4th year, fate dealt the girl another crushing blow. She was left all alone, her father frowning and taciturn, but so reliable, died. In the shop where he was working, a gas cylinder malfunctioned and a fire broke out. There were few victims, but Kira's father was among them. Only left alone in the whole world, Kira realized that all this time felt the support and love of a loved one. Yes, her father was like that. He couldn't express his feelings, didn't speak much, but now Kira realized how much he did for her. About a year the girl came to herself, getting used to the new world without her father, and then Andrew came into her life. Andrew was a student of their university, but he studied at a different faculty at the law school. That year he, like Kira, was finishing his studies. They met at a common lecture for soon-to-be graduates, which was held in the auditorium. The young people were told about the very procedure of graduation, state exams and diploma, familiarized young people with possible employers, presented companies that offered jobs to the best and most diligent students. It was interesting. Kira happened to be among strangers. Her friends were sitting at the other end of the hall, but Kira was a little late, and there was no place next to them. Therefore, Kira had to settle down where there were still empty chairs. At first, all the girl's attention was focused on the stage. She caught every word of the speakers, even wrote something down. Kind of boring and unexpected question caught the girl off guard. She turned around to the speaker. A handsome guy was looking at her with a smile. A wide, white-toothed smile, correct facial features, and bright blue eyes immediately charmed Kira. There was such interest in them. The girl suddenly felt that she was not indifferent to this man. "It's deadly dreary," repeated the young man. "And the weather outside is so wonderful. Spring is in full swing. There's a festival of spring flowers in the park, by the way. Why don't we run away?" It was the first time Kira had seen this guy. Besides, the lecture was very important and interesting. And after it, Kira and her friends agreed to go to the library to prepare together for the test. But all this somehow suddenly lost importance, and the girl nodded in agreement. The guy glowed, as if her answer made him the happiest person ever. He confidently took Kira's hand and led her away from the classroom. The weather really turned out to be wonderful. The sun was shining brightly from a clear, soft blue sky, and the newly blossomed greenery was fresh and clean. The air was filled with the aromas of plants that were beginning to bloom. On the way, the young people got acquainted. It turned out that the guy's name was Andrew. He admitted that as soon as he saw Kira, immediately could not take his eyes off her. "You're just an incredible beauty," he said, looking at the girl. And the one, strangely enough, did not feel a shadow of embarrassment, although always distinguished by modesty. I looked at you. I dared to speak for a long time. I was so afraid you would send me away. When you agreed to leave with me, I had a mountain off my shoulders," Andrew admitted. Kira was pleased to hear those words. She liked Andrew more and more. What if she had forbidden herself to even dream about him so that she wouldn't be disappointed? What if he was the man she would later start a family with? Yes, these thoughts visited Kira at the first acquaintance. They started dating. Andrew turned out to be a reliable, loving, sensitive man. Having learned the story of the girl, he took her under his wing. In everything, he tried to help Kira. The guy even helped her make repairs. More precisely, he did it himself, almost alone, because the girl did not understand anything about it at all. A little more time passed. Young people graduated from university, and both got a job. Kira became an accountant in a small firm for the installation of intercoms. Andrew went as an assistant judge in the local court. Kira knew by then that Andrew was growing up without a father. His mother had given birth to him at a rather late age, as they say, for herself. She was a powerful woman who had spent her entire life working in a management position at the airport. Even now, at her advanced age, she was reluctant to leave her position. Andrew kept trying to introduce Kira to her, but for some reason the girl was afraid. What if Andrew's mother didn't like her? What then, if this woman will be against the relationship of her only son with a poor commoner? Andrew laughed at these fears. "Mom isn't like that. Yes, she's used to bossing around, but in everything that concerns me, she gives me freedom and autonomy. I've been on my own for 6 years. She's always worked hard, and I've stayed at home on the farm. So don't worry, I'm not a mama's boy, and she's not a monster." Still, Kira persistently made up excuses not to go to Andrew's mother's house. Worried, afraid of this meeting. And then Andrew proposed to Kira. It cannot be said that it was completely unexpected. Relationships of young people have long been strong, warm, very close. The way of life without each other they no longer imagined. The girl had no doubt that Andrew was exactly the person she had dreamed of since childhood. He gave her everything that Kira so lacked: love, attention, care, tenderness. With him it was possible to talk about any topic. A soulmate. A soulmate. Sometimes Kira couldn't believe her happiness. But all this might not have happened if she hadn't found herself that day at the lecture in the chair next to Andrew. Such a fateful accident. Andrew did everything beautifully, just like in the movies. Invited Kira to a restaurant to celebrate his small promotion. The girl did not even guess about the true motives of this date. Then suddenly musicians came up to them and played a beautiful melody. Kira, flapping her eyes in surprise, looked at the men in white tails. Then a waiter appeared with a luxurious bouquet of roses. Andrew took it from the hands of the young man and with a smile presented it to Kira, then deftly pulled out of his pocket a velvet box. "Be my wife," Andrew smiled, looking into Kira's eyes. "You are the most beautiful girl in the world. I love you and I really want to be by your side forever." The girl then even had tears flowing from her eyes, so moved was she. This proposal was made so beautifully. Andrew carefully prepared for the meeting, so much thought out. What was happening resembled a scene from a good, though not too original, melodrama. The young people began to prepare for the wedding. Both decided that they did not need a lavish celebration, just a party with friends from the university and a restaurant. And yet it was necessary to solve a lot of issues, to book a place in the registry office, to find a restaurant, to think over the menu. And of course now Kira had to meet Andrew's mom. There was no point in postponing the meeting any longer. Kira remembered the day she'd first seen Maggie. The girl had been terribly nervous, but the woman who opened the door seemed to be smiling at her quite genuinely. Tall, slender Maggie looked very stylish in her elegant dress, with her hair slicked back smoothly. A real lady, and she behaved in a very friendly and polite manner. True, Kira immediately realized that Andrew's mother belongs to the so-called cold type of women carrier, accustomed to work hard, compete, and achieve their own. From such a woman cannot wait for heartfelt conversations, warm hugs. You couldn't expect any worldly advice from her. Maggie will definitely not become a second mom. And in the role of a cozy grandmother, spoiling grandchildren with pies, it is also difficult to imagine her. But that's the small stuff. Maggie caused Kira respect and even admiration. You bet, because she achieved so much on her own, became a big boss and a wonderful son raised. All this alone, without the help of her husband or relatives. After the wedding, the young people began to live in Kira's apartment. Both worked. Andrew received a good salary. Enough even for some excesses: cafes and restaurants, beautiful clothes, concerts, and most importantly, for traveling. For 2 years of marriage, Young managed to fly to the sea 5 times. Not to luxury resorts with 5-star hotels, but still it was a wonderful vacation. Fun, carefree, full of sun and warmth. Kira and Andrew together learned to lead a household. In principle, the young wife knew how to do everything because she had been living alone for a long time. But the head of the family had to master new skills. Although Andrew coped with it quickly and even as if playfully, Kira felt happier than ever. Nearby was a man who understood her half a word. Andrew listened with interest to Kira's news, accumulated during the day, in all situations took her side, and also often hugged his young wife on and off. Kira realized that she finally met the man she had dreamed of for so long, and mentally thanked fate for this chance encounter. And then the newlyweds had their first son, Max. The name was chosen by Andrew. That was the name of his neighbor, who paid a lot of attention to the boy and became for him a kind of replacement for his grandfather. This was a respected man, serious, intelligent. He headed the local factory for a long time. That would be our Max, as smart and responsible, turned out, dreamed the young father, rocking his tiny son in his arms. Kira nodded her head. She had slightly different plans for this child. The young mother wanted Max to be happy and healthy, and the rest was not so important. You didn't have to be a factory manager at all to feel joyful and peaceful. Max really turned out to be a lively and incredibly curious kid. He was ahead of his peers in many ways. Early went, early spoke. The baby constantly asked his parents questions, was interested in the world around him, tried to understand literally everything. Newly baptized parents did not want a soul in the firstborn. And so when he was about 4 years old, they decided that it was time to give birth to Max's little sister. Kira hoped that she and Andrew would have a daughter. She wanted to give that little girl all the things she didn't have: pretty dresses, fancy hairdos at matinees, conversations about girlish secrets like hugs and kitchen chores and such. But Vince was born a wonderful blue-eyed baby, charming in the first days of life, charismatic, attracting the attention of others. Well, for a daughter then? Next time Andrew smiled, rocking the stroller. It was their first family stroll through the city. Max was holding onto the handle of the stroller too. He was so looking forward to his brother, so excited to see him. But when Vince was brought home from the hospital, he was a little disappointed. It turned out Max had hoped his brother would be older right away. He'd imagined a boy with whom he could play catch-up or hide and seek. Time flew by at a dizzying speed. It turned out that coping with a couple of little boys at once is not so easy. And then Maggie suddenly came to Kira's rescue. Every day after work, her mother-in-law hurried home, quickly changed her clothes, had dinner and went straight to her daughter-in-law. Andrew was often delayed in court, sometimes came only late at night. By evening, Kira was completely exhausted, and at this difficult period, Maggie appeared. To take care of the grandchildren, she would go out with the kids to walk in the yard. Sometimes they'd go farther, to the park. It was only 2-3 hours a day at the most. But how Kira waited for them every time. While the children were away, she had time to clean up, cook something, go to the bathroom. And all this in peace and quiet. It would seem a trifle, but for a young, tired mother, it was a real salvation. How grateful Kira was to Maggie. She repeatedly told her mother-in-law about it, and the latter smiled discreetly and replied that she herself was happy to communicate with her grandchildren. No, a warm and close relationship between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law never developed, although Kira wanted it very much. She invited Maggie to tea, tried to make frank conversations, but this woman was some too aloof, cold and inaccessible, like the Snow Queen. Either she had such a character, or she didn't like Kira very much after all. Eventually, Kira stopped worrying about it and accepted the situation as it was. Maggie did not interfere with her daughter-in-law with advice, reproaches, and moralizing. She appeared when Kira badly needed her, and helped the young mother a lot. Perhaps the woman herself did not even realize how she supported Kira in a difficult period. Some more time passed. The boys grew up. Now they both went to kindergarten, and Kira was finally able to go to work. There was more money in the family. The couple began to plan a summer trip to the sea. It was to be the first for their children. And then life in the country began to change. Enterprises were closing one after another. This fate befell the firm where Kira worked. The woman was out of work. Andrew's salary began to be delayed steadily, which, by the way, at the new price level was not enough even for the most basic necessities. Andrew was now practically never at home at all. After a working day in court, he ran around the city in search of part-time work, somewhere to guard a warehouse, somewhere to help unload a truck. The man grabbed every opportunity to bring an extra penny into the house. Kira was now at home. She was looking for a job in her specialty. She ran to interviews, gave ads in newspapers, but there were no results. As a result, the woman could not even find a job as a salesperson. The supply of jobs in their town at that time far exceeded the demand for them. Kira was glad that she had at least managed to find a job as a cleaner. Now she cleaned the entrances of the neighboring building in the early morning while everyone was still asleep. The pay was low, but the upside was that the job ended before noon, and the whole day was free. Money was scarce, the children were growing at a dizzying rate, and their clothes were quickly becoming too small for them. They also needed to eat a full meal. Andrew and Kira could sit on buckwheat or pasta, but the boys needed vitamins, meat, fruit, and milk. Young spouses were often close to despair. It was Maggie who kept them from being completely lost. She had long ago been cut down, as she was old enough to be on a well-deserved vacation. And just someone needed a warm place, which for a long time was occupied by a firm and principled boss. But for years of work at a fairly high post, Maggie managed to save a certain amount of money. She dreamed of buying a small house by the sea, where she expected to meet old age. But circumstances have changed, and prices have risen. Now the woman's savings would not be enough for a decent place to live, and she was not going to buy anything. So Maggie used her savings to sponsor a young family every month. Both Andrew and Kira knew that if anything happened, they wouldn't be lost. Maggie wouldn't let them go under. But at the same time, they both didn't want to abuse the woman's help, and so they tried, stretched as hard as they could. It was hard, and yet the feeling of a strong rear guard kept them from getting discouraged. Despite everything that was happening, Maggie still remained for Kira incomprehensible, almost a stranger. Her mother-in-law kept her distance from her daughter-in-law, and with her son she did not open up and did not hug. But with grandchildren, a different matter. Only next to them the woman blossomed. She unashamedly hugged, kissed, called affectionate nicknames. And the boys reciprocated her grandmother. Kira sometimes tried to talk about it with her husband. "Never mind," Andrew replied. "That's just the way she is." I will try to keep the text as close to the original as possible, without adding new sentences and paragraphs. The length of the text will be roughly maintained. Dialogues and direct speech I will highlight according to the rules of the Russian language. The text will be divided into paragraphs. Phraseologisms will be replaced by more modern or simple expressions. Punctuation marks will be inserted according to the rules of the Russian language. All names and city names will be replaced with American names written in Russian letters. Name substitutions will be made according to the suggested list or made up by yourself if the name is not on the list. Mom was always like that. He smiled. Just a person so kind, good, loving. But she doesn't know how to show her feelings. Maybe it's because Mom grew up in an orphanage, didn't get love as a child. So she doesn't know how to express her feelings. But she's reliable, and she doesn't abandon her own. When Andrew and Kira's sons went to school, Maggie took over the lessons. It turned out that she once, many years ago, wanted to become an elementary school teacher. Then the woman's career took a different path, but now the long-time dream was realized in her grandchildren. Grandmother enthusiastically practiced with the boys. She knew how to be strict and demanding, but at the same time she emphasized to interest Max and Vince, to instill in them the desire for knowledge, to develop the innate abilities of her grandchildren. While their parents were trying to make a few extra pennies and were out working, their children were not running around the yard as street kids. They were under the reliable supervision of their grandmother, who invested a lot in their development. The result was pleasing. Both Max and Vince were the best students in their classes. They also excelled in sports. Maggie had time to drive them to the volleyball club on the other side of town. In this sports center worked the best coach, and Maggie did not agree to anything less for her grandchildren. And so they lived, trying their best, supporting each other, raising their children. And then one day Andrew got tired of living, as the man himself put it, a miserable existence. He decided to risk opening his own business. It is clear that the money for the promotion of the businessman took from his mother. And where else? Not in the bank at a crazy interest rate to make loans. Andrew bought in a neighboring city from a warehouse small things, technical sold on the market more expensive and immediately received, albeit small, but a profit. Success inspired. Andrew decided to work in this direction and registered as an individual entrepreneur. Kira helped him with the documents. She was an economist. She worked as an accountant for a long time. So reporting and primary documentation were entirely on her. The couple rented a place in the market and started work. At first, the business was slow. The client base had not yet been built up. Links with suppliers had not been established. Profits in the first few months were either minimal or non-existent. I had to solve many different problems. Sometimes I even wanted to give up, but in the end the business went on, and the small store earned money. Finally, the family had some money, albeit small, but it was their own. They didn't have to ask Maggie for help anymore. Andrew had even managed to pay her back the money he had borrowed to develop the business. Kira knew that her mother-in-law tried to refuse, to give this help as a gift to the young family, but Andrew insisted. They still flew to the sea. The boys were old enough to be truly impressed by everything. Kira watched with what joy they were running along the beach, and her heart sank with delight. What happiness this was. There was more to come. Andrew's business grew. Soon the man opened a whole store, then another. Now he had a whole staff working for him, accountants, managers, salespeople. But Kira was given the opportunity not to work and to deal with the house and children. True, the boys had already become teenagers and no longer needed babysitters. But the family moved to a private house, and Kira had a whole garden at her disposal. For its improvement, the woman took up with energy and inspiration. And again, she thanked fate for what is happening in her life. A house of full cup, a loving husband, wonderful, talented children. Every day a reason for joy and pride. And the garden, where Kira felt herself a full mistress. Here she felt calm, relaxed, peaceful. The woman believed that her present life was a reward for what she had to endure as a child. She also often regretted that her father did not see how wonderful life was for his daughter. Probably he would be happy for Kira and certainly did not dote on his grandchildren. And yet, as time went on, Kira began to realize that something was missing. Andrew had grown distant. No, they still had a wonderful relationship. Her husband was never rude to her. Always remembered holidays and their personal dates. Only he was too busy working. He came home late at night, traveled a lot, literally lived his life. Max and Vince are almost adults. They have their own lives, their own friends, their own interests. And that's fine. It's just a little sad that their sons have grown up so fast. And Kira hadn't had time to fully enjoy their childhood years. She'd been too busy surviving. Maggie remained alien and cold. Such a character. Kira probably didn't even know how or what to talk to her about until now. Their only topic of conversation was probably Vince and Max. Her mother-in-law was old, but she still looked like an iron lady. She refused to move into her son's house from her own apartment, where she'd been a full-fledged mistress. And Kira understood and supported her in this. And in this difficult period in the life of Kira again knocked happiness. She did not even believe her feelings at first. She thought just, it seems, afraid. Even the thought of letting it be true. But then it all became too obvious. Kira realized she was expecting a child again after all these years. Andrew seemed pleased, but still took the news a little too reservedly. There wasn't the excitement in his eyes that he'd had years ago when he'd learned of their wife's pregnancy. "Wow, this is unexpected," he smiled. Then he pulled Kira to him and kissed her. "We need to find you the best doctors. We're getting older. You understand?" Kira understood. And of course she was worried too. Pregnancy when you're in your 20s is very different from a woman in her 40s. There are definitely more risks. Sons took the news of the imminent arrival of a brother or sister positively. "Wow, we will have a little one." Max smiled. "It's so weird," Vince shook his head. "But I like little one. It's fun." They're funny, Maggie smiled at the news. "Well, it's unexpected, of course. But it's nothing special. I had Andrew when I was a little younger than you. Everything's going to be fine now." Despite Kira's fears, the pregnancy went easily. However, as an older woman, she had to undergo more frequent examinations. At the next ultrasound, Kira lay on the cold couch and prayed to herself that everything would be all right with the baby. She, of course, dreamed of having a daughter. And for a very long time since childhood. After the birth of her 2 sons, the wish had somehow been forgotten. And there was no time for that. And now, having found out that she was pregnant again, Kira began to hope again. How she wanted to become a mom of a charming girl. The woman chased these thoughts away from herself, convinced that one should be happy about any child. And it is unlikely that after 2 boys suddenly such a miracle will happen. Why would it suddenly be a girl? Now, lying on the couch, Kira wanted only one thing, that this child that lives under her heart, everything turned out to be all right. And boy or girl a matter of 10th. After all, how many of their cases are terrible? Being pregnant with her first sons, Kira did not know a lot of things. Now she had a lot of information that made her heart clench anxiously and her eyes stare into the face of the doctor who was running a sensor across her abdomen to read her emotions. Kira kept thinking the doctor was frowning. How scared she was. Was it really that bad in there? "Do you have a girl?" suddenly said the man in a white coat in a calm and mundane tone. A hot wave of joy flooded Kira's heart. even a little dizzy. She didn't expect to be told the sex so early, and now it was a girl. Was this really happening to her? Had her dream come true after all? After all these years? Is she all right? Kira asked the question she wanted to know. Everything is fine, there are no abnormalities, reassured the doctor. Kira was born on time. Kira had long ago thought of a name for her future daughter. It seems, still in the university, Emily. Kira, Emily, sounds similar, and that's great. The girl was born a healthy baby and soon became the family's favorite. Maggie now came to Kira's house every day to babysit her granddaughter. Once again, her help came in handy. Kira adored her daughter because she had waited so long for her. She had already stopped dreaming of such a gift of fate, but sometimes she needed time to go to the bath or to go shopping alone. And that's where Maggie came in. Time flew by at breakneck speed. Kira already knew that this is what happens when you have a small child. He's just a helpless little baby. Before you know it, it's already a person with its own character and hobbies. Emily turned out to be a pretty little girl. She took after Kira. She was just as dark-skinned, slender, and graceful. But her eyes were her father's bright blue, huge like two lakes. They shone on her beautiful, swarthy face. The boys grew up. Max graduated first. He easily got into the Boston Medical Academy. Max must have decided in the 5th grade that he was going to be a doctor. At first, his parents thought it was a frivolous hobby. But as time went on, the eldest son stayed true to his dream. In the end, he entered the medical school, and on a budget. Kira at first was afraid to let the young guy alone in the big city. But Max was serious and independent enough for such an enterprise. So in the end, the mother had to respectfully accept his decision. A few years later, Vince followed his brother. He also entered Boston University, but he chose a different specialty. From childhood, he was attracted to computers, programs, technical puzzles. His sons had flown the nest, and his husband was living a life of work. During this period, Kira realized what a happiness it is that she has a daughter small, beautiful, loved and loving. She filled women's lives with joy and happiness, made it bright and meaningful. If it were not for Emily, Kira would feel now all alone and not needed by anyone. Emily practiced ballet. Emily was a ballerina, and the girl was great at it. Choreographers all said the little girl has a real talent. Kira knew that her daughter went in her. Except that in childhood, Kira did not have such an opportunity to show her gift. Her father certainly didn't take his daughter to potential toys. Emily, on the other hand, did. The girl even traveled with performances in different cities. A real tour, and loving, caring mother everywhere accompanied her. It was a bright and rich life, which gave Kira a daughter. Everything was good, just wonderful. The boys studied and worked in Boston. Kira sometimes visited them. The sons were happy, and that was gratifying. Andrew was developing his business, which was becoming more and more profitable. Now Kira also had a daughter. A long-standing dream had come true after all. It would seem, live and be happy. But the heart of the woman more and more often clenched from some vague premonitions. Something was wrong, something was not right. Kira chased bad thoughts away from herself. Even to the psychologist was going to turn. But one day the reason for the vague anxiety revealed itself. Kira then went to the shopping center to find a dress for the next performance of her daughter. She wasn't feeling well, must have caught a cold somewhere. So Maggie stayed with her. Kira went to the mall alone. The woman was in high spirits. She had found a wonderful outfit for her daughter, and it was just the right size. She imagined how delighted her girl's eyes would shine when she took out this airy, shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow miracle from the branded bag. That's when the woman noticed Andrew. She just happened to glance down, going up the escalator, and saw downstairs, on the first floor, her husband in a bright orange shirt, which she herself gave him. It was a stylish shirt with short sleeves, summer, dressy and elegant at the same time. Andrew liked it immediately, and now he often wore it to work. Andrew was not walking alone. He was hugging a young girl. From afar, Emily could not see the details, could not see the stranger's face, did not have time to estimate her age, but she noticed the main thing. Andrew's hand was resting on the lady's slender waist. She, in turn, had her palm in the back pocket of Andrew's pants, and Andrew was smiling happily. The world turned upside down in just a few moments. Kira was walking up the escalator steps as a happy, accomplished woman who thought she had succeeded in building a strong family. And she arrived on the next floor as a cheated and betrayed spouse to gather her thoughts. Kira went up to the food court, settled at a small table in the far corner of the hall, and ordered herself a coffee. What she'd just witnessed. How to explain it? Kira really wanted to find some sort of justification for what she'd seen. She couldn't. If she wanted to, she could still convince herself that Andrew was just walking through the mall with a female employee. Maybe they wanted to look at a competitor's assortment or something, but certainly not like that. Andrew had his arm around the stranger's waist. Both of them were not embarrassed at all by people, who at this time in the mall were plenty. They walked with their arms around each other and smiled as if they were carefree free students, and between them there was clearly a special relationship between them. It was immediately apparent. Is Andrew cheating on her? It's hard to believe, almost impossible. But why impossible? Kira began to reflect on her life and realized that she and Andrew had long lived as close relatives, but not as loving spouses. All their conversations revolved around the children and their future. When was the last time they went out together? Besides, Andrew was too often missing at work, flying on business trips. Maybe it wasn't business trips at all, but traveling with young mistresses. Kira found it hard to breathe, as if she'd been hit in the solar plexus. She was short of air. Everything was spinning in front of her eyes. Was her happy family life just an illusion? And how stupid did she have to be not to see it? Kira decided not to get emotional. She pulled herself together and got up from the table. She should go home and act like nothing had happened. When Andrew returned, she would discreetly take his phone and look into his correspondence. Then it'll all make sense, and then we can do something about it. We need proof. Otherwise, it's a lot to make up. Maybe it's not that bad. That night, Kira put her plan into action. She'd always trusted her husband. It had never occurred to her to go through his phone before, and Andrew knew it because his cell phone wasn't even password protected. The man had quietly left his phone on the coffee table when he went to the bathroom. He generally assumed his spouse was already asleep, but Kira wasn't asleep. As soon as the sound of water came from the bathroom, she slipped out of bed and went downstairs, grabbed her husband's cell phone, logged into his messages. And there was a lot of interesting stuff there. Kira learned that her husband's lover's name was Kate. She was only 25 years old, not much older than Max. The deceived spouse even saw numerous photos of young beauty Kate. Mostly on them, the girl showed all the advantages of her undoubtedly luxurious figure. Young, incredibly beautiful, bold Kate was not shy in expressions and wrote such things, about which modest Kira was even embarrassed to think. But Andrew clearly liked it. Apparently, the couple had already had quite a long affair. Andrew was firmly hooked by the young beauty. They called each other cute nicknames, made plans for a summer vacation. Apparently, lovers have not the first time they went together to vacation by the sea. It hurt to read this correspondence, but she needed to know what was going on. What she saw shocked her. She didn't want to believe it was true. The correspondence was also about Kira. Kate had called her lover's spouse an old woman, an old joke. Even Andrew did not try to defend his wife. On the contrary, he sent smiling smileys in response, saying that he was amused. How? How could this happen to them? They were once the closest and dearest people to each other, two halves of one whole. They had overcome so much together, and suddenly this. The sound of the water in the bathroom faded. Kira hurriedly put her phone back where it belonged and rushed into the kitchen. Let Andrew think she was just getting a drink of water. For now, she didn't want to show her husband that she was aware of this ugly affair on the side. She didn't want to, or she just couldn't. She needed to digest the news, figure out how to proceed. Realize, after all, what she really wants, and get used to the idea that Andrew an unreliable wall, behind which so cozy to hide from the hardships of life and the usual traitor. Outwardly in the life of the family, nothing has changed. But now Kira became more attentive. Andrew's delays at work and his constant business trips were perceived quite differently. From time to time, while Andrew was in the bathroom or out without his phone at the neighbor's, Kira would look through his phone. Kate texted Andrew frequently. Some of the messages were quite explicit. They were usually accompanied by pictures of the girl. To Kate's credit, she looked great. Judging by the state of her body, the girl spent long hours in the gym. From the correspondence, Kira realized that Kate does not work and does not study. Typical Andrew content that he was apparently willing to pay for it all. No, Kira knew that men just over 40 often pay attention to young nymphs. Probably they feel younger, more energetic, stronger with them than with women of the same age. And what is there to hide? 25-year-old girlfriends, in most cases much more attractive than 40-year-olds. Spouse and reaper. But the woman thought her family wouldn't be affected. She remembered the way Andrew had looked at her, what he had said to her. He genuinely loved Kira. Once upon a time, she hadn't doubted that in the slightest. Could such feelings also grow cold with time? Kate. She was no longer just a lover or a girl for occasional entertainment, which at any moment can be abandoned, changed for another. The relationship between Andrew and his young lady was about 5 years old. Sometimes in their correspondence glimpsed historical dates, and the oldest of them came about the time when Susan was born. Apparently that was when they had met. Kira remembered that period of time after giving birth, and with a newborn baby in her arms. She didn't feel very well. She probably looked even worse. Kira was completely focused on her health. Her daughter, even her sons, had no energy at that time. Thankfully, by the time her sister was born, they had long since managed to become fully independent young men. Of course, Kira paid almost no attention to her husband, because as it seemed to her, it was not necessary. A grown man, passionate about his work. But maybe that was where the mistake lay. Maybe she herself was to blame for what was happening to their family now. Kira shook her head and chased the wrong thoughts away. What was her fault? It was Andrew, after all, who had decided to look for fun on the side. No would support his wife in a difficult period, to take on some of the responsibilities, to take care of his wife and newly born daughter. No, Andrew chose a different option. Maybe this lovely Kate isn't his first mistress. Andrew had been estranged for a long time. Kira was now clearly aware of that. It's just that the woman preferred not to notice such trifles as distant alarm bells. He earns, does everything for the family, does not drink, does not beat, does not humiliate, and money does not limit. Well, that's great. What else is there to complain about? So Kira didn't complain. She lived and enjoyed a happy, as it seemed to her, family life. And then suddenly it hit her. Maybe Kate was not Andrew's first mistress, but in the fact that it was with her, he had a fairly serious relationship, Kira did not doubt. Andrew was truly in love with the girl. It could be felt in the tone of his messages. What only affectionate words he did not call his mistress. The man protected his lady from household, financial, and any other problems, gave gifts, constantly interested in her desires. It hurt Kira to read this. Perhaps so he did not behave with her even in the most golden years of their marriage. It is understandable then they were spinning, surviving, pulling children, not to sentimentality was. From the correspondence, Kira realized that Kate was pressuring Andrew about the divorce. "When will you divorce your old lady?" the girl questioned, supplying the message with anger-red emojis. "All in good time," baby Andrew replied. "I'm in the process. A lot of things need to be prepared so that we can live not only happily but richly." My princess loves a beautiful life." After all that sweet tone, Andrew's usually reserved and serious tone almost made Kira feel nauseous. But she continued to read the messages, searching them for information about the impending divorce. This moment interested her more than others, because it directly affected both her and the children. Kira was not particularly worried about how her sons would take the divorce. They were already adults, and both of them had been living on their own for a long time. For them, most likely, little will change. But the daughter, she is used to this house and adores her father. Despite his indifference, the little girl will be very worried. Kira had no doubt about that. And something would have to be done about it. In Andrew's messages sometimes slipped that he did not rush into divorce to properly prepare for the care. What would that mean? The spouse was clearly up to something, and Kira wanted to find out what it was about. As far as her relationship with her spouse was concerned, nothing much had changed since Kira had found out about Kate. Faking ignorance was easy. Kira and Andrew had hardly spoken to each other for a long time. Hey, how's it going? How are the kids? That's all they talked about. And that's the life they've had for a long time. Why didn't Kira realize this before? Perhaps she was too busy with her daughter and immersed in her own worries and plans. Kira, of course, didn't tell Maggie about her son's life. She still came over occasionally to play with her granddaughter. There were times when Kira took Susan to her grandmother's house to run errands. But the relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law never became warm and frank. Over the years, Kira had trusted Maggie completely in everything concerning the baby. Perhaps it was the only person with whom the woman could leave her daughter with a light heart. But otherwise, over the years, Maggie and Kira had remained, in general, strangers to each other. No, of course, Kira couldn't tell Maggie about Andrew, though she wanted to share it with someone. Why worry the older woman? Of course she'd be upset to hear about her son's behavior. Will be worried it will negatively affect her health. Of course, the mother-in-law will still find out about the divorce, which of course will have to go to. Even if Andrew had not planned this procedure, Kira herself would have organized it. Because how to live with a traitor? That's how she now perceived her spouse. Well, you fell in love with someone else, say it directly. Why lie, lurk, make cunning plans, thought Kira. Andrew had not even once pulled Kate back when she insulted Kira in her messages. She called her old lady and fat and stupid selkie. Andrew at best ignored these unflattering remarks, at worst replied with approving emoticons. It was offensive. But Kira was much more interested in the vague promises of the spouse to divorce as soon as everything will be solved financially. The spouse was preparing something, some kind of scam, according to the results of which Kira was to be left with nothing. The man did not write about it directly. It is understandable correspondence with the mistress had a completely different character, was light, humorous, in some places passionate. But by some words and hints Kira understood that Andrew was up to something. But how would she know what surprise to expect? Surely the details of the plan Andrew and his mistress discuss when they meet. Kira, understandably, felt hard about the whole situation. The pain of betrayal, the uncertain future, the suspended state. And there was no one to share it with. If her mother were alive, how much easier would this misfortune have been to bear? Kira slept badly, nervous. She turned pale and shriveled. She became irritable, withdrawn. Her physical condition even worsened, with headaches. One morning when Kira was feeding her daughter breakfast, her mother-in-law called. "Are you home now?" Maggie inquired. "Yes," Kira replied, deftly slicing bananas, pouring porridge, serving nuts. "Andrew is already at work and my daughter and I are home." "Great, I'll be right over." Kira cheered. "That's great." So her mother-in-law would babysit Emily. She'll go to the doctor herself in the meantime. Her head was hurting too much. Have them prescribe some pills. I can't take it anymore. Maggie showed up, as usual, with a present for the great, a beautiful doll in a big pink box. The girl threw herself on her grandmother's neck. No, not because of the toy, of course. It was just that there was some special bond between Maggie and Emily. It seemed that grandmother and granddaughter understood each other without words. Something similar Kira had observed before with her sons. Maggie was a wonderful grandmother to all her children, sensitive, caring, attentive. It was surprising, considering her bossy, somewhat cold nature. Surprising, but wonderful. It's so nice to know that your children are so loved by someone other than you. Good morning, Kira smiled at her mother-in-law. It's so good to have you here. Emily has missed you already. I'm actually the one who came to see you today. The smile directed at her granddaughter slid off the older woman's face. She stared at her daughter-in-law absent-mindedly. Kira immediately tensed, sensing that this was going to be about something serious. Go into the living room and watch cartoons, Kira turned to her daughter. Okay. Here was a rather dire situation for Kira. It seems that Maggie's mother-in-law guesses or knows about Andrew's infidelity. Maggie is clearly concerned about this and wants to talk to Kira straight, perhaps to caution her or give her advice based on her life experience. This is certainly a painful conversation for Kira to have. She's already suffering from her husband's betrayal, and now her mother-in-law is broaching the subject. On the one hand, Maggie's support can be very valuable in such a situation. But on the other, Kira, perhaps, will be even harder to realize that what happened has become the property of relatives. Overall, the conversation promises to be very emotional and challenging for both women. It is important for Maggie to approach this sensitive topic with sensitivity and understanding, not blaming, but trying to support Kira. And Kira will need to gain strength and patience to listen to her mother-in-law and perhaps make some difficult decisions after their conversation. The situation is far from ideal, but at least Kira has someone close to her who cares. Age was coming to an end as well. Kira didn't see any candidates around her for the role of a father for the future child. That's why she went to the resort that summer, to fulfill her long-time dream. I lied to Andrew about having an affair at the resort to get pregnant, Maggie said. He wasn't the only one who thought so, by the way. I announced to everyone that my pregnancy was a conscious move, but it wasn't. Kira was silently catching every word. She'd never heard such candor from Maggie before. I was about 35 at the time, a young woman by today's standards, with everything ahead of me. Back then, I was considered an old maid. All the time to become a mother and a wife had passed. The train had left. Maggie continued. She wasn't too worried about it. Maggie was fully devoted to her work. She had a responsible position, and she was always busy. The woman liked to realize that she was such an important, indispensable person at the airport. She was respected, listened to, and even feared. Sometimes she wanted to have a child, but sometimes there were regrets that there probably wouldn't be a child. Maggie wasn't too upset, though. She herself had grown up in an orphanage. She had seen so many unhappy fates and wasn't 100% sure she could be a good mother and make her baby happy. That summer she was sent on a trip to the sea from the airport. Maggie could afford to buy the tickets herself, but the union honored her as Employee of the Year. It's nice to be recognized. The resort was wonderful. Comfortable room next to the sea. In 5 minutes walk, a wonderful dining room. And there, in this sanatorium, Maggie met Andrew's future father. It was a so-called business traveler, a young guy about 10 years younger than Maggie herself. He came from some northern town on work. It was Helia's first time at sea, and he looked a little confused at first. It even looked nice. Maggie first noticed him in the dining room. The young man immediately caught her attention. He was good, really good looking, this Helia. Hair the color of ripe wheat, bright blue eyes. Those eyes ended up playing a key role in Maggie's fate. He had amazing eyes. I guess they made me fall in love with him like a girl, Maggie said. I don't think I'd ever seen anything like them before, not even when I was young. Bottomless, bright blue, attentive. Andrew inherited them, and so did Max and Vince. Wow! Helia has no idea he has a son and grandchildren, and that they have his eyes. Maggie was now looking everywhere with her eyes for a cute guy. At first she didn't understand why she was doing it. But the guy was very young. I bet he'd have a lot of admirers soon. Young, pretty young things just like him. And so it was. For several days Maggie watched from afar as Helia returned to the sanitarium with one and another beauty. All of them were like a selection, slim, tanned, smiling. Helia himself smiled a lot. He had a wonderful smile. From it on his cheeks appeared charming dimples. One day the young handsome man himself approached Maggie. Helia confessed to me that he has been watching me for a long time. He's incredibly attracted to me, she said. It was unexpected to hear that. A young, handsome guy, whom I had been admiring from afar for about a week, was giving me compliments that made my head spin. I was desperately jealous of all those young beauties with whom he appeared in the sanatorium. And he, it turns out, at the same time dreamed of me and did not dare to approach, afraid of rejection. He said I looked beautiful and inaccessible. Maggie and Helia began a stormy resort romance. They took many walks in the neighborhood, swam at night in the sea, laughed. Maggie felt 10 or 15 years younger around him. I don't think I've ever laughed so much even in my youth, she recalled. It was a wonderful week. I fell in love, I just lost my head, which I don't usually do, Maggie said. It was so unlike me. It was like Helia cast a spell over me. And I didn't see a lot of things. A lot of obvious things. Maggie always paid for her date at cafes, in the dining room, on excursions. He never gave her anything, but she didn't expect him to. Being around this guy was a gift in itself. Then one day Maggie woke up in her room, expecting to see Helia next to her. They'd taken a long walk along the promenade at night, gazing at the stars, talking about everything, and had fallen asleep with their arms around each other in the morning. Maggie felt so happy and peaceful in the arms of her lover. But when she woke up, she didn't see Helia there. I reached up and rolled over onto my other side, Maggie recalled. I still wasn't worried about anything. It had happened before. Helia had probably just gone out for coffee and pastries to surprise me. How nice it is to have someone care for you like that. Maggie dozed for another half hour, enjoying the peace and quiet. But the longer she was alone, the more she realized that something was wrong. Finally, unable to bear the anxiety any longer, the woman stood up. That's when it all became clear. There were no belongings of Helia, no clothes, no favorite wristwatch. He had even remembered to bring a little thing like perfume and a toothbrush. So Helia left while Maggie was asleep. He left quietly, so he wouldn't wake the woman and have to explain himself to her. How's that? Why? Everything was fine last night, Maggie wondered. A wave of sadness, despair, and resentment washed over me. I couldn't breathe. I wandered around the room like a stranger and couldn't find a place to go. My heart clenched with unbearable pain. I thought I had found my soulmate. Helia was so easy, so pleasant, and even though he was much younger, I felt supported by him. Nothing could have predicted this outcome. Even last night, Helia had hugged me tightly, showering me with kisses and compliments. I was seriously planning our future together, Maggie said. Helia lived in a small town up north. He even asked me to go there. And I was ready to give up my career, my apartment, my friends, everything to be near him. In desperation, Maggie opened her closets again and again. Could Helia have just moved his things somewhere else? And himself? Well, he might have been late for some reason. But Helia's clothes were nowhere to be found. But Maggie noticed some of her own things were missing. A box of gold jewelry. She had taken a small portion of her treasures with her on vacation. But they were her favorite 2 pairs of earrings, a dainty chain and a bracelet with small sapphires, original, exquisite pieces. The bracelet was actually brought to me from Germany, Maggie recalled. Now this jewelry box had disappeared. There was no half-empty bottle of Chanel, no. 5 on the bathroom shelf. In the safe closet, I missed 3 dresses I bought when I was on vacation in Riga. You can't find such dresses here. My heart clenched with a bad feeling. Was Gilia really just a criminal? Maggie asked herself. I should probably write a statement to the police. On the other hand, it would be shameful to have to confess to strangers that I lost my head like that, blindly trusting a young traitor. I'm a grown woman, a boss. Maggie sat down on the couch, hugged herself tightly, and began to sway. That's what I used to do when I was a little girl, she recalled. I grew up in an orphanage. There you can't get comfort and sympathy from adults. So I got into the habit of comforting myself. As an adult, I somehow outgrew this ritual. And now, in a moment of stress, the habit has returned. We should get out of this stuffy room and take a walk on the beach, Maggie decided. The fresh sea breeze would give her strength and bring relief. As she approached the front door, she noticed a note. Helia had left her some kind of message on the mirror. My heart jumped with joy, a faint hope that everything would still be all right. Maggie shared her memories. Maybe he's just preparing some kind of surprise? Maggie thought. And here I was almost going crazy with worry. But there was no miracle. Helia had indeed turned out to be a traitor. Only for some reason it was important for him to explain his behavior to Maggie. I guess by now you have already realized everything he wrote in a note. Are you crying? Angry at me, scolding yourself for being gullible. I don't know why I'm writing all this. Usually I just walk away. But you're really special. I can't do to you what I do to others. I really like you. You're strong and noble. And you're a real beauty. Probably any man would be happy beside you, but not me. I realized a long time ago that my happiness is different from most people's idea of a prosperous life. I like adventure, changing places, meeting new people. I realized long ago that I could never be with just one woman. Family, children, everyday life. It's not for me. That's the way I was born. My mother says I took after my father. I never knew him, by the way. He's also a vagabond, an adventurer. This man probably doesn't even know I exist. It doesn't matter, though. Of course, I haven't told you a word of truth. Well, almost none. The fact that you are very beautiful, intelligent, strong, I really think so. Those words of mine were sincere. As for my biography, I named the wrong city. I lied about my age. My name isn't even Helia. That's my favorite part. Making up a legend, pretending to be someone else. Some people imagine me as a young actor, others as a talented young engineer. It all depends on the inspiration. Sometimes it comes to me, and I compose a story about a tragic fate, full of hardship. It's fascinating, interesting, exciting, and women love it. I know how to make them happy, even if it's only for a short time. Those glowing eyes of yours, those admiring glances. I make the gray everyday life of lonely ladies bright, colorful, magical. You have to pay for all these things in life, wrote Gilia. That's why I charge a small fee for happy weeks and days. You'll agree that it's only fair. Our week, it was one of the happiest weeks of your life, wasn't it? I'm moving on. New adventures, new stories await me. And you? No offense. You're really special to me. I usually leave in silence, I don't leave notes. But I wanted to explain myself to you. Maggie stared hurriedly at the sheet of paper. What she was reading was hard to put into her head. Helia, who was not even Helia, turned out to be a professional Alfonso, living off women, flitting through life like a careless butterfly. He plays different roles and enjoys it. Most likely we are talking about a special mental disorder, thought Maggie. But a normal person can't live like that. The strangest thing was that when she read the note, she agreed with Helia. The guy was right. This week really had been the brightest and happiest week of her life. Maggie decided to leave this story in the depths of memory, sometimes to return to it again, to feel those bright, positive emotions that gave her Helia. But it turned out differently. After returning from vacation, Maggie realized that she was expecting a baby. I realized that it was the child of Gelia, a man, perhaps not quite mentally healthy, she recalled. But I decided to keep it because first of all, I was tired of being all alone, and secondly, I guess I still loved Helia. Or rather, the image that young man had created. At the due date, a wonderful, healthy, and strong boy was born. He had Helia's eyes. Maggie had noticed that back at the birth center. The handsome, charming baby inherited other features of his father's appearance. He bore little resemblance to Maggie. The woman prayed that the resemblance to Helia would be limited. Knowing the genes Andrew had inherited, Maggie paid special attention to his upbringing. She developed in him responsibility, honesty, and kindness, and Andrew seemed to grow up to be a wonderful boy. With anxiety, Maggie searched in her son traits of reckless adventurer, as was his father Helia. But she didn't find them. Andrew faithfully prepared his lessons, never skipped classes at school, and then at the university. When the guy grew up, Maggie watched his relations with girls with bated breath. But even here, Andrew did not resemble Helia in any way. Before Kira, he dated a former classmate. They had been a couple for several years in a row, no stormy short-term romances. When her son married Kira, Maggie exhaled. It's okay. Andrew has a beautiful wife, wonderful children, his own business. No, the son is nothing like the character of a wealthy Alphonse father. It's not that bad. But it turned out that she had rejoiced too soon. Maggie shook her head. Now I'm going to have to tell you the bitter and ugly truth about Andrew. I kept quiet while it was none of my business. Went through everything inside of me, but now my grandchildren's welfare is at stake. I can't let them be left with nothing. Kira knew what she was talking about. I know he's cheating on me, she said. Andrew has a young mistress. I've seen them together and even read the sweet couple's correspondence. Maggie's eyebrows rose in surprise. And why didn't you scandalize him? How did you even get over it? I'm just confused, Kira admitted. The opportunity to discuss the situation with someone made her feel better. Yeah, it's Andrew's mom, but I felt like she was totally on my side. I see. Maggie nodded. Anybody would be confused. So you know about this Kate? Kira nodded, then asked, but how did you know about it? Andrew told me, Maggie said. He said he'd been unhappily married for a long time. That you, as a wife, do not pay attention to him. You've lost yourself in the children and the house, become uninteresting and indifferent. The usual male excuses. It was painful for Maggie to realize that the son, the only child, in whom so much invested, apparently still inherited the genes of his father. Even if not immediately, they had taken over. Kira could barely hold back her tears. But maybe he's right. I've been really busy with the kids in the house. Maybe Andrew really did miss my attention. I wish we'd talked about it in time. He's wrong. Maggie was adamant. There's more to it than that. Sometimes the feeling goes away. It happens and it's normal. But this is different. Andrew's lying to you, hiding, and that's the worst part. He and Kate are going to leave you with nothing. You and the kids. How? Kira gasped. She was used to the idea of Andrew cheating on her. And here was a new shock. It seemed to her that her husband adored children and would do everything to provide them with a happy future. And now this. Although these hints that he's preparing for divorce. They have a plan. Maggie shook her head sadly. When I heard it, I wanted to give up both the plan and my son. But then I decided to keep my emotions to myself. If I don't agree, they'll come up with something else. Now, girl, listen to me carefully. Andrew felt like a happy man. He achieved a lot in life, built a whole mini empire, organized a network of stores of sanitary ware. The man had a right to be proud of himself. His family life up to now, everything suited him: a beautiful wife, wonderful children, well-adjusted life. It was a kind of quest to get funds for the family, buy a new car, change the apartment to a large house. And then these tasks somehow ceased to fascinate and bring joy. It became too easy. Andrew no longer needed money. They were enough for new acquisitions and for traveling and for children's education. The man was suddenly bored. And then just at this very moment in his life appeared Kate, young and energetic, who loves adventure and adventure. She worked as a sales clerk in one of his stores. One evening, Andrew stopped by one of his stores to talk to the accountant, but she was no longer there. But behind the counter stood a new saleswoman, incredibly beautiful Kate. She was openly flirting with her boss. Andrew at first resisted the feelings that arose. His mother from childhood brought up in him responsibility, hammered into his head the true values of the family. But when it happened, he realized that all these years he had lived in the captivity of his own attitudes. With Kate, Andrew felt young and energetic again. She loved adventure as much as he did and was capable of risky actions. Existence without this girl now seemed bland and boring to Andrew. So it went on for several years. Feelings did not subside, but only flared up with renewed vigor. Andrew literally went crazy about his young, beautiful mistress. He did not want to part with her for a moment, but every night he had to return to Kira, and the atmosphere of the house, once warm and cozy, was now weighing on him. Andrew felt like he was in prison. His lovers were talking more and more about how he needed to divorce Kira. It was a done deal. True, both of them didn't want half of the property to go to his lawful wife. She didn't work, did she? Kate resented her. She was sitting at home, relaxing, watching soap operas, and you worked. All property should belong to you and only you. That's true, Andrew sighed. But the law is the law. Kira will be given half of the jointly acquired property. But isn't there a loophole? You can hire a good lawyer, Kate insisted. Let him figure something out. And one day there was. It was simple and complicated at the same time. It was suggested by a lawyer who was familiar with such matters. I have already had such cases in practice, he said. You need to sign over all the property to a person you trust, said the man in a stylish suit. And your wife should trust him too. Maybe a close friend or relative. My clients explain this to spouses to preserve assets in case of business problems. Everyone has their own version. After that, you can initiate divorce proceedings. There's no property, nothing to divide. And the trustee, after everything, just rewrites houses, apartments, cars on the already divorced spouse, that is, on you. That's it. Andrew thought for a long time. After this conversation, he had only one candidate for the role of such a proxy as mother. Kira would easily agree to sign over all the property to her. She trusts her mother-in-law, but how to come to her mother with such a request? After all, you'd have to confess everything to her. Still, there was no other way out, and Andrew decided to have a serious conversation. He realized that his mother would not be delighted with the situation. But she's his mom. She will definitely support her son, help. It was a pity to give Kira half of what he earned, especially since Kate is right, the wife did not work, lived a quiet and relaxed life. What right does she have to all this? Maggie listened to her son in silence without interrupting. As always, she looked unperturbed and somewhat detached. The only thing that betrayed her anxiety was her fingers, which were relentlessly running over the long sleeve of her sweater. Have you made up your mind? Maggie asked when her son had finished. Yes, he nodded. Don't you feel sorry for Kira? I've fallen out of love with her. She's obviously indifferent to me. So now we have to suffer together for the rest of our lives. And what about the property? She hasn't invested a penny in the house or anything else. So it's all fair. I was the only one who worked. She was the one who provided for me. And she raised your kids, Maggie reminded me. Thanks to Kira, you could think of nothing else but growing the business. She always took care of the rest. And remember, at first Kira helped you a lot. Doing those reports at night, making estimates, Maggie said. And then you had a staff of accountants. You're exaggerating, Mom, really exaggerating what she did. All right, what about the kids? You could see that Maggie was taking great pains to control herself. What about the children? Are you going to pay child support? Help out like that. So you'll help me? After a brief silence, Maggie nodded her head. Andrew could see from her eyes that his mother didn't approve of what he was doing. Well, he didn't expect anything else. The important thing was that she agreed. Andrew signed over all the property to Maggie. Kira didn't suspect a thing. She immediately believed in the fairy tale that Andrew thus just avoided unnecessary risks. Kira had not been paying much attention to anything lately. All her time and attention was devoted to her young daughter. Well, all the better. Kate was as happy as a child. She should be, because everything was going so smoothly, without problems. It seemed to open up a happy, carefree future ahead. Kate and Andrew planned to celebrate their success with a trip to the sea. They had already chosen a resort, even argued a little about it. One day, when all the property was already rewritten to Maggie, Andrew dared to have a frank conversation with Kira. The man, of course, was worried. All the same, to tell the person with whom he lived for so many years, such news is not very pleasant. But Kira took everything surprisingly calmly. Naive woman, apparently, has not yet guessed that she will not get anything in the divorce. She would only find out in the courtroom. And even if she finds out sooner, there's nothing she can do about it. Andrew officially moved into the apartment he'd rented for Kate. Now it was just the two of them, waiting for the court hearing, after which Kira would have to leave home. Where? Her own apartment, the same one they'd lived in before Andrew's success. The ex-wife and her daughter won't be on the street. And the boys, they're already in another city. Young men on their own. You don't have to worry about them at all, Andrew said. And so, finally, the day had come. Andrew and Kate had waited so long for this date. Today, at last, everything will be over. Andrew will get his freedom. A little later, he will transfer everything from his mother to himself, and the sweet couple will fly to the beach with white soft sand. Kate decided to go to the meeting. Together with her lover, she put on an elegant marriage suit, emphasizing the advantages of her gorgeous figure, made light makeup, let her hair down. Andrew once again admired his beautiful beloved. Yes, she looked like a supermodel from the cover of a magazine. In his youth, Andrew had never dreamed of such girls. And here he was, a stunning beauty was in love with him. In the conference room, Andrew immediately noticed Kira. She looked surprisingly calm and dignified. For some reason, Maggie was sitting next to her. She was wearing a suit that she had worn as an airport employee on particularly important days, days when she needed luck. His mother's presence confused Andrew. He was worried. Why was she here? She's sitting next to Kira. She's here to support her sister-in-law. Odd, given their plan. Kate tensed at the sight of her future mother-in-law, too. She'd taken a dislike to Maggie beforehand. Realized the older woman wasn't thrilled that a young rival had broken up her son's tight-knit family. So what? What did her opinion matter? Absolutely nothing. Maggie greeted her son and his companion with a nod of her head. Kira, on the other hand, said hello loud and friendly, even smiled. The hearing began. The judge read the divorce decree, determined the place of residence of the minor daughter with her mother, and announced the amount of alimony, which should now be paid monthly on Emily Andrew. And then it came to the most important thing of all: property. Since you do not have any common property, you have nothing to divide, the judge concluded the speech. Yes, the marital apartment will remain for her. But that's not all, Maggie reminded her. It's all about the divorce case, the judge looked at her reproachfully. As for your gift, it's not a subject for discussion in court. What gift? Andrew jumped up. His heart clenched with misgivings. Kate, sitting next to him, smiled happily. She did not suspect anything yet. "The deed of gift I made to Kira," Maggie replied, looking pointedly at her son. "To Kira and the grandchildren. What did you think? I'm going to leave them on the street with nothing, so that you can live happily ever after, and they'll all live in a cramped apartment." Andrew's eyes went blurry. He hadn't expected this from his mother. He looked at Kate. The girl's beautiful face was twisted in an angry grimace. She opened and closed her mouth in surprise, trying to say something, but not a single word escaped her tongue. She even seemed to be out of breath. Kira looked calm and peaceful. The judge was reading out some more formalities regarding the divorce. Maggie was whispering about something with her sister-in-law, and it was slowly dawning on Andrew that it was over. Of course, Kate would leave him now. She wouldn't stay with him through the hard times. That was absolutely certain. He'd have to start all over again. All over again. "That's it. I've had enough of this. I'm filing for divorce," said the wife to her husband. At these words, the husband became numb. "That's it. I can't live with Nick anymore. I'm filing for divorce." Anastasia sat in her sister Nayli's kitchen and complained about her husband. "I can't take it anymore. I've lived with him for 28 years, and now everything about Nick annoys me. The way he eats, the way he sleeps, the way he walks around the apartment in his slippers. I can't stand him anymore. I want to live for myself for the rest of my years." "Anastasia, what will you do with the apartment?" Nayli asked anxiously. "I don't think it's possible to exchange it without paying extra. You can't throw Nick out on the street. He has a share in the apartment too. You'll live like neighbors in a communal apartment? How are we living now?" Anastasia was indignant. "After my daughter got married and moved in with her husband, Nick lives in one room and I live in the other. Only I still wash his clothes, cook his meals, clean on weekends, and he comes home from work and falls on the couch. Never once cleared a plate off the table. Do you know how much money he makes?" Anastasia grinned. "I'm ashamed to say. How many times have I told him, change jobs, but the only thing I've heard is, I'm fine with it, and I'm sick of carrying everything on my shoulders." "Oh, I don't know what to tell you." Nayli shook her head. "It's hard to live alone, too. I know how it is. When my Matthew was alive, I didn't like a lot of things about him either, and when he was gone, it was as if the light had faded." "I won't be alone," Anastasia said nonchalantly. "And if I don't meet another man, it's okay. Without a man, too, you can do just fine. Remember how in the movie Girls the main character said, 'I decided not to marry at all. One is calmer, I want lackeys. I want gingerbread.' But you loved Nick once, didn't you?" Nayli shook her head. "Even scandalized her mother and threatened to leave home if she did not allow you to marry a colleague Titov. You didn't listen to anyone and did it your own way. You could have talked her out of it." Anastasia looked angrily at her sister. "Maybe my life would have turned out differently." "You're telling me." Nayli shook her head again. "If you've got it in your head, no one can change your mind. It's bath time." Nayli got up from her chair. "Let's have a steam. It'll get the crap out of our heads." Anastasia stood up and stretched. "I need to warm up my bones, because my back has been aching lately before the bath." Anastasia went out into the yard and sat down on a bench that stood near the pamiatnik. It's a pity they sold her parents' house, she thought, looking across the street. It would be a good place to come back to. She grinned. "I can't live in the country again. I was used to city life. And I needed the money. I'd just gotten a 2-room apartment. I had to furnish it. The money from the sale of my parents' house came in handy. and we spent it on a car. I wanted to please the man I loved, Anastasia grumbled, deciding to get some fresh air. Nayli came out of the anteroom. Breathe, breathe. You don't have this in the city. It's all chemistry. When I come to the city, I get a headache. How do you live there? I've lived in the country all my life and I'm not going anywhere. Call me a hillbilly. I was born here, I'll die here. Yeah, life has flown by and I haven't even lived it yet, Anastasia sighed, squinting against the bright sun. I just got married and had a daughter, and I might be a grandmother soon. Anastasia had known Nick since she was a little girl. He was best friends with her older brother Andrew. They went to school together, went swimming at the river, and raced bicycles. Benjamin always tried to follow Andrew, but he always chased him home and even swore at him. But Anastasia didn't care. She was secretly in love with Dan Titov, who seemed much older than her brother and did not even hide from anyone that he was already smoking cigarettes, although he was barely 14 years old. The sun's rays penetrated through the curtains, waking Nick from a deep sleep. He took after his father. He grumbled to his mother, Rosalie. I suppose he's going to end up with an alcoholic and a companion like Dan. Good thing Carla got rid of her husband. He'd frozen to death outside his house drunk in the winter. They found him in the morning. Anastasia paid no attention to her mother's nagging, continuing to stare at Nick with loving eyes. Except that to him she was still little, as he called her, even though she was only 2 years younger. When Andrew left for the army, Nick was taken too. Anastasia wrote letters to her brother, saying hello to Nick, and was very happy when in a return letter her brother wrote back to her saying that Nick sends his warm army greetings to you too. After graduating from the 8th grade, Anastasia decided to enter the culinary school, although her mother suggested that she go to the city and apply to the trade school. But she did not want to go far from home, because in a year were to return from the army Andrew and Nick Thompson. Nayli had married by then, moved into her husband's house, and was expecting her second child. She rarely visited her mother and sister, because she had no time to be with her own family. In the evenings, Anastasia and her mother dreamed that when Andrew returned from service he would marry Vivian. Although Vivian, who faithfully waited for him from the army all 2 years, she sometimes ran to Anastasia, bragged that she had thought up the style of the wedding dress, and white shoes, which she and her mother bought in the city department store, were already lying in the closet in a cardboard box, waiting for the celebration. When Andrew and I have a baby, Vivian said cheerfully, "You'll be his godmother. I want a son to be the firstborn." She rolled her eyes dreamily. "And then we can have a couple of girls. But the main thing is that the first must be a son." "Oh, you're dreaming." Rosalie looked affectionately at the future daughter-in-law. "It's hard to manage with 3 children." "I know myself nothing. I am strong," laughed Vivian. "And with a husband like Andrew, I can do everything." Vivian continued to dream. "He grew up caring, hardworking, and handsome. Other girls envy me that a guy like him could love me. You'd think I was ugly." "Oh, no, no, no," Rosalie shook her head. "You and my Andrew are a very good couple, and I'm very glad you're getting married. We just have to wait a few months until he comes back, and then we'll want a wedding like this. 3 days of celebration. If only my Anastasia could find a good groom. Then I'd have peace of mind for all my children," Rosalie sighed. But her mother, embarrassed, Anastasia ran off to the other room. Rosalie and Vivian laughed loudly. But the dreams were not destined to come true. A month before the end of the service, Andrew died. No one knows how it happened. Or rather, the command, of course, knew the circumstances of his death, but said only one thing: an accident. From grief, Rosalie in a flash grayed and could not believe that in a closed coffin is her son Andrew. "It's not him, not him." She wailed at the cemetery, watching the grave mound grow. I just recently received a letter from Andrew, in which he wrote that he would soon return home. Mom, calm down, Anastasia, clinging to her mother, trembling with all her body, begged, "Let's go to the wake. Everyone's already there." Rosalie swore after her daughter, turning to look at the fresh grave where her only son lay. Soon Nick returned from the army and, without going home, went straight to the Martyanovs. Seeing him, Rosalie splashed her hands, hugged Nick, and wept bitter tears. "You tell me that my Andrew is alive." The woman looked hopefully at Nick. "We saw you off to the service together, so you must return together. Tell me that you deceived me, brought to the coffin of another man's son." "No," Aunt Rosa. Nick shook his head. "Not deceived." He sighed heavily. "I'm sorry." Bye. Nick quickly went out into the yard, sat down on a bench, and lit a cigarette. Nick didn't notice how Anastasia silently walked over to him and sat down next to him. "Welcome back," she said quietly. But Nick shuddered with surprise. "Oh, I'm scared." He almost dropped his cigarette and smiled. "Wow, how you have grown, quite a bride has become." "How did Andrew die?" Anastasia asked quietly again, staring off into the distance. "I don't know," Nick answered hastily. "I was on leave that day, and when I returned to the unit, I was told that Andrew." He was silent again. "In short, that Andrew is no longer there, and no one explained the reasons to me. You know, the army, there is a lot of secrecy." In fact, Nick lied. He knew that his best friend died because of him, and now he was tormented by conscience. On another leave, Nick met a girl and started dating her, but she had an older brother who was strongly against it. He warned Nick that if he did not get away from Grace, he would be in big trouble. But Nick only grinned, saying that nothing would scare him. On that fateful day, Nick and Andrew walked out of the unit together to go about their business. Nick was excited about his date with Grace, and Andrew decided to buy gifts for his family. After all, he was about to be discharged soon, and he wanted to return home not empty-handed. They had barely rounded the corner of the concrete fence when they ran into a group of guys, including Grace's older brother Benjamin. He looked at Nick sternly. "I warned you to back off my sister. Well, now hold on." Benjamin swung and hit Nick with all his might, who fell to the ground, but he jumped up and came at him. A fight ensued. Andrew could not stay away and rushed to help his friend. Benjamin took a knife out of his pocket and wanted to stab Nick with it. But it so happened that the knife hit Andrew right in the heart, and he fell down. Everyone froze, not expecting such an ending. "Cops!" shouted Benjamin, and the boys scattered. Nick ran after them. He wandered around the city for a long time and returned to the unit only in the evening. There he was told that Private Andrew Martyanov was killed. There were no more details. Nick was interrogated, as it should be, because he was seen leaving the unit together with Andrew. But he, afraid that he could go to the brig, said that as soon as he and Andrew went out of the gate, they went in different directions. And he knows nothing more. Until the end of the service, Nick was afraid that the command of the unit guessed that Andrew died because of him, and even stopped going on leave. But everything went well. He was no longer summoned for interrogation. And now, looking at Anastasia, he felt ashamed of her and Aunt Rosa, that they had lost a son and a brother. "It's me," Nick got up from the bench. "If you need anything, contact me to help with the household or something else. After all, Andrew and I were best friends. I, so to speak, will help you." "Thank you," Anastasia looked at him gratefully. "And then Mom says that we are completely without male hands left. Even digging the vegetable garden is now no one." "Not a problem," Nick said. "I'll come to you tomorrow morning." But in the morning, Nick did not show up. All night he celebrated his return with his friends. and in the morning he was hungover. He went to bed and slept through the night. "So where is your assistant?" Rosa asked her youngest daughter snidely. "I guess I shouldn't have praised her yesterday that Nick would help us with everything. I'll have to go back to Jake's house again. He'll do anything for a bottle. Last time he dug our garden so hard, nothing grew. But there's no way out. I don't have any strength left. And look at you. Skinny, you can't hold a shovel." "Mom, you'll see. Nick will come," said Anastasia, looking out the window. "He promised to help us in everything instead of Andrew." "Oh, Andrew, my darling son," Rosalie wailed. "And who did you leave us for?" Anastasia did not listen to her mother and ran out of the house. She walked along the country road and, reaching the house where the Titovs lived, looked through the fence into the yard. Aunt Carla was doing chores, and Nick was nowhere to be seen. "Something's peeking out," Helia Swan, Nick's friend, sneaked up on her. "Why don't you come inside?" "I'm not looking at anything," Anastasia replied fearfully. "I was just passing by and stopped for a moment to catch my breath." Well, well, well," laughed Helia. "And I already thought that you decided to visit some fiancé? After all, we haven't seen each other for 2 years. Probably missed you." He laughed out loud again. "It's too much." Anastasia stepped away from the fence and walked away. But she heard Helia enter the house and shouted loudly, "Nick, stop snoozing, you already have brides waiting for you at the gate." Anastasia blushed and walked even faster towards her house. She thought that Nick had forgotten his promise. And what was her surprise when, waking up in the morning, she went out into the yard and saw him in the garden with a shovel in his hands. "Come on, show me which beds to dig." He squinted against the bright sun. "Sorry I couldn't come yesterday. I was celebrating my return from the army. You should understand." "I understand," Anastasia nodded her head. "You dig, and I have to get ready. I'm going to miss the bus." "Where are you going this early in the morning?" Nick wondered. "Are you in a hurry to go on a date?" "What date?" Anastasia laughed. "At the school I go to class in the morning and then come home in the afternoon. I was offered a dorm room, but I turned it down. How can I leave my mom alone? I've been driving back and forth all week. Good thing it's vacation soon, I won't have to go anywhere." "Be careful," Nick grumbled. "And if anyone hurts you, tell me right away." "Oh, who needs me?" Anastasia was embarrassed, but she was glad that Nick was worried about her. From that time, Nick began to come sometimes to the Martyanovs that fence fixes, or the doors in the barn. "Mom, look, what a hard worker, Nick," said Anastasia with delight. "He's helping us like he promised." "Yes," Rosalie said. "But that hard worker always smells so bad that it's impossible to stand next to him." "So what?" Anastasia shrugged. "A man can have a drink after work, can't he?" "Oh, Anastasia," Rosalie shook her head. "You're still young, you don't understand a lot of things. If a man drinks, it's bad for the family. The wife, the children, and the rest of the family suffer. Look at our neighbors Timofeevs. Their Pete's been drinking as long as I've known him. His wife Nancy has come to our house barefoot and with babies to escape her husband's wrath. Why doesn't Aunt Nancy divorce Pete?" Anastasia asked in surprise. "Why should she put up with such an attitude?" "Where would she go?" Rosalie sighed. "She's got 2 kids on her hands, and now she's pregnant with her 3rd. She has no help from anyone. Her parents are dead. She will endure her husband's antics for the rest of her life. And she loves that alcoholic. She admitted it herself." "No, I couldn't do that," Anastasia shook her head. "I would have filed for divorce right away." "Easy to say, but hard to do," Rosalie grinned. "Not every woman would decide to get a divorce. and we don't like divorced women. Even if she were a widow, there's nothing you can do, fate. But divorced women are like some kind of lepers. You can't invite them to your house. She may look back at another man's man. It's medieval, Anastasia laughed. We passed in school. I do not remember in which country, but if a husband died, they killed his wife and buried her next to him. And in another country, I don't remember which one, if an older brother died, the younger brother got his wife, Anastasia continued. And no one asked if he wanted to marry her or not. Holy, holy. Rosalie crossed herself on the icon. Such wild customs. Thank God we do not have such a thing. In the fall, Nick decided to go to the city. He got a job and now he rarely came to the village, and Anastasia became sad. Every weekend at a certain time she passed by the stop where the bus stopped, hoping to see Nick. But alas, her expectations were in vain. A year later she graduated from college and got a job in a canteen. One day she was returning from work and saw Nick walking towards her. Oh, Anastasia. Nick. He looked at her. You look different. You look so much prettier. I didn't even recognize you at first. How are you? I'm not married yet, Anastasia said, embarrassed. What about you? You haven't gotten married? I'm going to. Nick grinned. I've come to choose a bride. Pick a bride? Anastasia asked. Didn't you find one in town? No, not in the city, Nick grinned. There are too many demands. They give flowers, candy, gifts, and in general they're kind of spoiled. You have to take care of them, bring coffee in bed. Ugh. He spat on the ground. A wife should take care of a man, feed him, do his laundry, understand? Not the other way around. That's how it is in our village. The man is the master of the house, and the wife must obey him in everything. That's why I decided to choose a bride from the locals. Why do you want to get married? Anastasia was surprised, and even so urgently. Nick lit a cigarette. I now work at the factory. I live in a dormitory. And they say that families can get an apartment. So I decided to get married, to get a separate place. And then I can get a divorce. No one will take my apartment away from me. He looked Anastasia over from head to toe. By the way, would you marry me? Nick asked. You're not a spoiled girl, you're not spoiled. You won't claim my apartment. So will you marry me? Or should I give you time to think about it? No, Anastasia shook her head quickly, not believing her happiness. I'll do it. Well, that's the deal. Nick looked at his watch. We'll have a proper wedding. Or, they will start to talk in the village. Come on, get ready. And I'll tell my mother to call the guests. I'll leave the money for her for a treat. And I'll come again in a month. You and I are getting married. Well, I gotta go. I gotta go see my friends again. Tell them I've decided to say goodbye to the single life. He was walking down a dusty road. Anastasia wasn't just walking home, she was flying on wings. Mom. She ran into the house and ran to her mother. I'm getting married. Nick Titov proposed to me. And fathers. Rosalie splashed her hands. Are you crazy? No, I won't let you. I won't let you marry him to spoil your fate. He's no good for you. Don't you get it? Tears came to Anastasia's eyes. I've loved Nick for a long time, since I was a little girl, she said. I never dreamed I'd be his wife, and if you forbid me to marry him, I'll leave home and you'll never see me again. I'll go to town with Nick and we'll get married there anyway. You'll be stuck with him all your life, Rosalie sighed. He's a fool. Can't you see that? I love him, she said, stomping her foot. And you can't stop me. What can I do with you? Rosalie sighed. You're just like your father, just as stubborn. Don't complain later, Anastasia. Complain about what? Anastasia was genuinely surprised. I'm going to have the happiest family because I'm marrying the man I love. Love. Rosalie grinned. You love him, but he loves you. Why did he suddenly decide to marry you? You've never met, never courted each other. He must have something to gain. No one's going to miss out, said Rosalie. There's something wrong with him. Mama, Nick is very good, said Anastasia, and twirled round her mother. Oh, I'm so happy. I'm going to tell Vivian about the wedding. Let her envy me. What can you do now? Rosalie resigned herself to it. Maybe it would work out for them. The wedding in the village was merry. The tables were set in the courtyard of the T-Dove's house, lavished with lavish whores, d'oeuvres, and alcohol. Anastasia sat at the head of the table next to Nick and smiled happily. And he seemed to pay no attention to his wife, only wrinkled and reluctantly kissed her when the guests shouted loudly bitter. Oh, Anastasia. Vivian, who had been a bridesmaid, moved toward her. You're going to regret getting married. He doesn't look at you at all, as if you weren't his wife at all. He drinks moonshine with his friends and looks at other girls. He's not used to me yet, Anastasia defended her husband. Wait, we will live together, then he will not let me out of his sight. Until then, let him drink and have fun. It's a wedding, not a funeral. Then let's have a drink with you. Vivian handed her a glass of champagne. To love. And lots of kids. Oh, come on. Anastasia waved her hand and took a sip of champagne, but it went down the wrong throat. Tears came to her eyes. Would you say kids too? We can't think about them yet, and we have to get settled in the city first. Nick will soon get an apartment from the factory. You'll have to furnish it. You'll be a city girl. Vivian looked enviously at her friend. You'll forget the village altogether, she said. Probably even stop coming here. Don't be silly. Anastasia was angry. My mother is here, my sister, my nephews. How could I forget them? Nick and I will often come to help with the household chores. While Anastasia was talking to her friend, Nick got up from the table and went somewhere with friends, taking with him a bottle of moonshine. Noticing that the bride was almost crying, her mother-in-law came to her, took her by the hand and led her into the house. Let's go and rest, said Rosalie. You must be tired for the day. I've made a bed for you in the back room so that no one will disturb you. What about the guests? Anastasia looked around in confusion. Them Aunt Carla laughed. They've already forgotten about you. As long as there is moonshine and snacks on the table, and the bride and groom are not so important. Lie down and rest. Where's Nick? Anastasia sat on the bed and looked sadly at her mother-in-law. Kolka, don't wait, she sighed. Now, probably on the river with his friends drinking. He's like his father. I, too, waited for my husband all night after the wedding feast. I sat on the bed like you. I shed bitter tears. And then I didn't live a sweet life. Oh, she waved her hand. What to say now? Life is lived, not Washington. She waved again and left the room. Anastasia got out of bed and walked to the window, beyond which it was already dark. She could hear drunken voices. Someone belted out a song, and the disorderly voices backed it up. It's going to be different for me, Anastasia thought. She took off her white dress and placed it carefully on the table, then lay down on the bed, covered herself with the blanket and closed her eyes. She fell asleep immediately and woke up to someone piling on top of her. Anastasia screamed, but a wide palm covered her mouth. What are you yelling for? Are you going to wake up the whole house? She heard Nick's voice. Didn't you recognize your husband? He continued to pile on top of her. Don't. Anastasia tried to say, but she failed. Come on, Nick poked her with his breath. You're my wife now and you should know your duties. Or didn't your mother tell you anything about them? He laughed. Come on, do not break. Or I'll go find another woman for myself. There are plenty of them in the village. Who would not refuse a man's caress? Anastasia obeyed in silence. Her lip was bleeding and she prayed to God that it would all be over quickly. In the morning, the guests gathered again in the Titov's yard. Anastasia no longer sat at the table, but as hostess, she brought the treats, washed the dishes, and watched Nick, who again had fun with his friends, forgetting that he had a young wife. And at night he was again pestering Anastasia, and she silently tolerated everything, only furtively wiping away her tears. A couple days later, Nick went into town for work. I gotta go, he mumbled as he put on his shirt. What about me? Anastasia looked at her husband in bewilderment. I have to pack. I have to quit my job. There's no reason for you to come with me now. I'll get an apartment, we'll get settled, and then I'll call you to me. And this. Give me your marriage license. I have to show them at work that I'm a married man now. Nick, when are you coming to pick me up? Anastasia was almost crying. We just got married. What will people say? He left his young wife at home and went to the city. But you do not listen to anyone. Nick counted the money and stuffed it into the inside pocket of his jacket. I'll settle down and take you to the city. So tell all the curious people. Let them figure out the rest. Let me at least walk you to the bus. Anastasia jumped out of bed and started to get dressed. I'll walk myself. Nick looked at her angrily. And you help my mother. Don't be lazy. Maybe I'll go to my house for a while? Anastasia suggested timidly. I don't feel comfortable living here without you. As you wish, Nick shrugged. Okay, I gotta go. The bus won't wait. He didn't kiss his wife goodbye. Nick walked out the door and walked briskly to the gate. Anastasia hoped he would turn around and wave at her. But Nick didn't even look back. She cried a little, and then gathered up all her things and went back to her mother's house. What have you done? Rosalie shook her hands when she saw her daughter. Mom, stop it, Anastasia cut her off. Nick went to the city alone to get an apartment, Anastasia said. As soon as he's settled, he'll come and get me, and we'll leave. Yeah, Rosalie said, her thin lips tightening. Words and words go here and there, but deeds go nowhere. Well, I've been married, so maybe I'm happy now. We'll live like we used to. If Nick wanted you, he'd have taken you with him instead of embarrassing you in front of people. Nick will come for me, Anastasia said, resenting her mother. And if I'm bothering you, I can go back to my mother-in-law's. It's my house there now, too. Lev already, Rosalie sighed. If you're back, we'll see. A week passed, another week, another month, and there was no word from Nick. Anastasia ran to the mailbox every day, hoping to see a letter from him. But she found nothing in the mailbox except the newspaper her mother had written. From acquaintances, she learned that Nick has already received an apartment, in which he now lives alone, and he doesn't even think of coming to the village. If that's the case, I'll go to him myself, she told her mother at breakfast. I'll get the address and then I'll go. Go. Rosalie shrugged. It doesn't seem very human. You're here and your husband's in town. I don't know what he's doing there. She put the food on her daughter's plate. Anastasia picked up a fork and picked up a piece of scrambled egg, but suddenly she turned pale and ran out into the yard, clamping her mouth shut. I see Rosalie sighed as Anastasia returned to the table. Now I guess I'll have to go into town to deal with your man. Mom, what are you talking about? Anastasia looked at her in surprise. You're pregnant, that's what. Rosalie shook her head. It's no big deal. There was no sorrow. Well, it can't be helped now. I won't let you disgrace yourself. She tied a kerchief on her head, went outside and headed for the Titov's house. Anastasia, did you fall asleep while playing Six in the Sun? Anastasia opened her eyes and saw Nelly holding a birch broom. No, Anastasia stretched. I remembered my life, how I had married a penny, how I had moved to the city to live with him. If it hadn't been for my mother, I would have been alone with my daughter in my arms. Our mother was a brave woman, Nelly smiled. She's remembered fondly. She never told me what she said to your Nick when she found him in town, but he came to the village like a sweetheart and took you with him. But she was very worried about you. She felt in her motherly heart that you weren't living well with your husband. How many times I told her not to tear her heart out. Did she listen to anyone? At least you didn't say anything when you came to visit, but kept quiet. What kind of husband and father would Nick make? What else could I say? Anastasia lowered her eyes. It was my own fault for not listening to my mother and marrying him. I've been tormented all my life. Now she cried out. All right, enough of this damp. Nelly rubbed her lower back. Go and collect the laundry while I make a broom for the bath. It's good for you, okay? You'll forget all your sorrows in no time when you take a broom bath. They say a broom is worth more than money in a bathhouse. Having undressed in the anteroom, Anastasia went into the steam room and squeezed her eyes shut with pleasure. It was really good and smelled of tar. She poured hot water into a basin and diluted it with cold water, pouring it generously from the ladle. Then she put the boiling water on the stone and, steaming with the broom, began to whip herself on her back and sides, saying, as her mother Rosalie had once said, gula on the back, that they may run away, gula on the legs, so that they run along the paths, gula on the shoulders so you can sleep at night. Anastasia doused herself with cool water and went into the anteroom to catch her breath. Then she went back into the steam room to wash herself properly. When she returned home after the bath, she laid down on the bed with her arms spread out. Oh, it feels so good, she said with ease, as if she had been born again. I left some compote in a cup for you on the table, said Nelly, taking the clean linen. I'll go and wash off the dirt and fatigue. Our mother used to say that scented steam not only heals the body but also the soul, not your city baths, which are of little use. While Nelly washed in the bath, Anastasia even took a nap, woken by the slamming of the front door. Rested, she made her way to her room. A flushed Nelly walked in. I'll be right back, and then we'll sit down to dinner. At dinner, the sisters drank a shot or two of moonshine, snacking on salted meat that lay appetizingly on the plate. Maybe he'll change his mind about getting a divorce. Nelly waved her hands again. What do you have to divide now? We've lived and lived. Soon you'll have grandchildren. Will there be a sense in life? It won't, Anastasia said. I'm tired, Nelly. I'm exhausted. I haven't bumped into the back of a chair. I've loved my Nick for so many years, and now suddenly I'm tired. What happened? Nothing much happened, Anastasia sighed. It's been building up for years. I'd reached the end of my patience. He quit 6 months ago, didn't he? Nelly looked at her sister in surprise. You said he'd never had a drop in his mouth. How much did he drink before that? Anastasia grinned. As long as I can remember, he drank as much as he did. As if you hadn't noticed. Nelly got up from the table and began to collect the dishes. When you married Nick, your mother and I told you he was following in his father's footsteps, but you wouldn't even listen to us. I thought he'd change with me. Anastasia looked sadly out the window. I thought that if I surrounded him with love and care, he'd forget about drinking. Only the hunchback can be fixed by the grave, Nelly said with a sneer. And your colleague will not even help. Why didn't you divorce and leave Nick right away? If life with him didn't work out, you had a place to go back to. My mom was still alive. And after she died, they didn't sell the house right away, she sighed. It was a shame to go back. And Nick loved my daughter. I couldn't deprive her of her own father. When he was sober, he was happy to take her for walks and bring her goodies. And when she went to school, he could help her with her homework. By that time, we already had a one-bedroom apartment, and we sold the house with you parents, and the money was divided. So I used the money to furnish the apartment. It's a sight to behold. I couldn't just leave it and go anywhere. It was a pity. Don't you feel sorry for your life? Nayli sat down at the table across from her sister again. I worked hard, from morning till night in the canteen to earn an extra penny. Kolya, where did they transfer your son because of his drunkenness to different laborers? He didn't last long there either. You had to carry everything on your shoulders to support your family. At least you could carry some food home from the canteen. You're right, Anastasia sighed. My older co-workers pitied me. They'd put butter in my bag, or a piece of meat, or fruit for my daughter. Nick was drinking most of his paycheck, so I had to cut back on everything. Thanks, Nayli. You helped me by sending me a sack of potatoes, onions, pickles, homemade eggs. That's how we survived. I kept hoping that Nick would improve, get a job, and we'd live like human beings. But alas, Anastasia waved her hands. All my hopes were dashed. When my daughter lived with us, Nick and I still had something in common. And when she went to college and moved to another city, that's when I realized we were strangers. Before that, it was like I didn't notice anything. It was like there was a veil over my eyes. I forgave him for scandals, drunkenness, insults, the eternal lack of money. He even tried to raise his hand against me, but I couldn't stand it. I remember I grabbed a knife from the table, which I used to cut cabbage. Anastasia continued. And how God kept me from sinning, I don't know. But Nick got scared, and from then on he only insulted me with words. You poor, poor thing. Nayli came to her sister and put her arm around her shoulders. All these years you've put up with it, and you haven't told me much. You had enough problems of your own, didn't you? Anastasia waved her hand. I buried a tyrant husband. My son started fooling around. Good thing he came to his senses in time, and I'm still here with my complaints. I put up with it. Somehow I kept hoping for the best. So what's changed? Nayli repeated her question. I've changed. Anastasia ran a hand through her hair. Since I got the other job, I've changed. I didn't notice anything before. Work, home, work. And I had the worst job in the world. I was running around like a squirrel in a wheel. I would get up early, then spend the whole day at the hot stove with smoking pots. And in the evening I could barely get home from fatigue. She'd go back to the stove. I had to cook dinner. And as I got a job in a pastry shop, which opened not far from home, and more free time appeared. And I looked at my colleagues, girls young, well-groomed, with arrows and hairstyles, and I am among them, like an old woman of 100 years. I felt ashamed. I started to earn more money and save it. I used to spend everything on groceries to feed my family better, but he got so brazen that he turned his face away from my food. He said it wasn't good. You could overdo it for your own husband. I was upset by such words and tried even harder to cook something delicious. One day I cooked a chicken, which turned out so brown with a delicious flavor. Nick, as usual, put a chicken leg on his plate and ate a little. Then he put the second one on his plate, took a little bite from different sides and pushed the plate away, saying he was full, but there was a lot of chicken meat left on the bones. When I saw that, I even cried. I always liked to eat chicken leg, but I rarely got it. I used to save it for my husband or my daughter. And I used to eat white meat, which I've hated all my life, Anastasia continued. So I started saving money, and I bought dumplings or put pasta and cutlets on the table. Nick threw the plates on the floor at first. But eventually he realized that I wasn't going to indulge him anymore. He ate every last crumb, going days without dinner. And I slowly renewed my closet, got rid of old clothes, and 3 years ago for the first time went to the sea with a colleague who went there every year. Can you imagine? Nayli, for the first time in so many years I saw the sea so warm and gentle. On vacation I enjoyed everything like a child, and I did not care that we rented some shed where there were only 2 beds with iron nets and sold mattresses. And all the amenities were in the yard. I then the whole year lived the memories of this vacation, and the next year again went to the south, having saved money for tickets. Oh, how Nick called me names before the trip. But I did not care. It was at the resort I felt like a woman, which men can still pay attention to. It was like I spread my wings and even had a little resort romance with no strings attached. Are you planning to go to your resort this year? Nayli grinned. I see you enjoyed it, didn't you? I did. Anastasia nodded her head. I liked feeling like a human being instead of a maid and a housekeeper. Well, it's time for bed. Nayli looked at her watch. I wish you were leaving tomorrow. I'd have stayed a little longer. They wouldn't understand at work, Anastasia said with a smile. The next day, Nayli walked her sister to the bus. You should think again before you make a decision, she said, hugging Anastasia goodbye. It's easy to tear things down, but it's hard to put them back together again. Anastasia nodded silently and walked up the steps to the bus. As she entered the apartment, she nearly tripped over her scattered shoes. Was it really that hard to clean up after yourself? Anastasia grumbled, putting her husband's shoes on the shelf. Nick walked out into the hallway, glaring angrily at his wife. Have you had enough of Dan Holm? Leave me alone, Anastasia shrugged him off. You'd better help me unpack my bags. Nayli's brought her presents, and she seems embarrassed. Is she trying to drag her own sister into her dirty business? Or did she lose her shame and show up with her boyfriend? Anastasia didn't listen to him anymore and went into the kitchen. It was the same as usual when she was away from home. The table was covered in grease stains. The sink was full of dirty dishes, bread crumbs on the floor. It was so hard to clean up after yourself. Anastasia grumbled as she put on her apron. I didn't get married to wash dishes and scrub floors. Nick replied defiantly, that's what women are for. And what are men for? To lie on the couch and scold their wives. Anastasia was silent, gathering her courage. Let's get a divorce. We've been strangers for a long time. Why should we torture each other? Why don't we? Nick answered immediately. I have no doubt in my mind that you'll never do it. Maybe I'm sick of it too. How do you feel about me? I'll find myself a young hottie, and you'll learn how to live without a man. That's the deal, Anastasia exhaled with relief as she began to clean up. We'll split the apartment, and we'll each get our own lives. And I'll finally have an orderly kitchen, not a pigsty like this. Nick looked at his wife resentfully but said nothing. He went to his room and didn't come out until the evening, and when he got hungry, he came to the kitchen and was surprised to find that Anastasia had not cooked anything. Had you forgotten your duties? He literally burst into her room. Do I have to go hungry? Have you forgotten that you and I are getting a divorce? Anastasia didn't even look at him, continuing to flip through the magazine. Learn to live on your own. Cook your own food now. And you're going to wash your own clothes too, by the way. I'm done working for you, Anastasia said. Oh yes, I'm sorry, I forgot that you're divorcing me, Nick said ironically. Good luck. He forcefully slammed the door to the room. Anastasia heard her husband slam the refrigerator door, swearing. Then something rattled and fell, but she didn't even go out to see what he'd dropped. Anastasia went to work in the morning, and on her lunch break, she went to file the divorce papers. She filled out the necessary application, stating in it the reason didn't agree on the characters. The court clerk's office accepted her application and marked it, and said they would send her a notice by mail when she would have to appear in court for a preliminary hearing. When she got home that evening, Anastasia went into the kitchen, poured herself some tea, and made a sandwich. She didn't feel like eating. Out of habit, she pulled a pot out of the cupboard to make dinner, but then suddenly laughed and put the pot back. She went into her room, turned on the TV, lay down on her bed, and closed her eyes. On the TV, a man and a woman were first figuring out their relationship, and then vigorously declaring their love for each other. Anastasia turned off the TV, covered herself with a blanket, and fell asleep until the morning. She didn't hear Nick rattling the dishes in the kitchen, making his own dumplings, and even washing his own plate, which had never happened before. 2 weeks later, Anastasia handed him a subpoena she'd pulled out of the mailbox. "What's this?" Nick stared at it, looking at the paper. A summons. Anastasia shrugged. "We have to appear in court the day after tomorrow. We're going to go to court the day after tomorrow to get a divorce." What, he yelled. "You weren't kidding, were you?" "No," the wife replied calmly. "And I also chose a few options for the exchange of our apartment. We'll have to pay extra, of course, but we can live separately." "I'm not going anywhere." Nick threw aside the summons. "I thought you were joking to scare me." "So you're serious about breaking up with me?" Nick asked. "We lived together for so many years. We raised our daughter, and now you've decided to start a new life. I knew you'd found a man." "You're a fool, Nick." Anastasia sighed. "Do you have only one thing on your mind? That I'm cheating on you? Are you judging me by yourself? I'll divorce you even if you don't show up in court. We have an adult daughter and no other children. So you and I will be divorced like sweethearts." Nick looked pitifully at his wife. "What are you thinking? We had a good life. Yes, I hurt you a little, but you forgive me, and we'll live like before. We're not in our 20s. We don't know how many years we have left. What do we have to share in our old age? What good things have I seen with you?" Anastasia turned to Nick. "Other people are vacationing together at resorts, shopping together. Husbands help their wives with chores. Where have you and I traveled together besides the village? We've never been anywhere else. You've never taken me to a restaurant or a cafe. You've never given me a single flower in our whole life together. And I've never seen a present from you on my birthday or New Year's Eve. You've only given me scandals on those days. Probably on purpose, so I wouldn't think about presents and flowers. When my sister and I sold my parents' house, I wanted to buy a fur coat with the proceeds. I bought you a car because you've been wanting one for a long time. Even though it's old, it's your own. You call that a normal life?" "Amelia, I'll make it up to you," Nick babbled. "I'll shower you with flowers." "You've come to your senses," Anastasia grinned. And he called her Amelia. "It's always Anastasia and Anastasia." "No, Nick, it's too late. I don't love you anymore. I used to, but now I don't." Nick lowered his head, turned around, and went to his room. After returning from court, Nick went back into his room and sat on the couch with his arms around his head. He remembered the judge's words over and over again. "I give you 2 months to reconcile. If at the second hearing you, the defendant, still do not agree to the divorce, you may be divorced without your consent." For the second time in his life, Nick was very scared. The first time was a long time ago, back in the army, when Andrew had been killed and the investigation into the case had begun. But now, when Anastasia decided to break up with him, there in court, Nick looked at his wife with different eyes. He suddenly saw the tired expression on her face, the cross lines on her forehead, the drooping corners of her lips, and he felt unbearably sorry for Anastasia. There was no one closer to him. He suddenly wanted to hug his wife, to hold her close, to confess his love to her for the first time. And he also realized that he would be lost without his ear, sink to the bottom, get drunk and die under some fence. All these years she had taken care of him, nursed him back to health after another binge. Yes, she'd swear, yell, get angry, but she'd never leave him in the lurch. And Rose's daughter? How will she react to her parents' divorce? Will she want to stay in touch with her father? Something had to be done. Nick got up from the couch and went to the window. But what? Would Anastasia believe his sincere remorse and take back the statement? The next day, when Anastasia got off work, she was surprised to see Nick standing by the car. "What are you doing here?" she asked, walking up to him. "Did something happen?" 3. "I was driving by and decided to pick you up to take you home." He was obviously embarrassed. "Maybe I need to stop at a store or something." "You tell me. You don't have to carry all the heavy stuff yourself." "You used to ignore the heavy grocery bags I used to bring home, and then my arms would get sore." Anastasia grinned. "Okay, let's go home. I've been on my feet all day." Yeah, and she opened the front door and saw a small bouquet of flowers on the seat. Who were these for? Anastasia wondered again. "What's the occasion?" "They're for you." Nick was a little offended. "You said I never gave flowers. I decided to buy some, and you're not happy again." "Oh, it's too late for that." Anastasia sighed, sitting down on the seat. "Still with you, even if you pick me up every day after work. I need to give flowers." Nick didn't say anything, turned the key in the ignition, and slowly pulled away. Anastasia sat next to him, holding a bouquet of flowers, and smiled. The next day in the evening, Rose's daughter walked in on them. "Dad, Mom, I have some news for you," she said, sitting down in her chair. "I don't know whether it will make you happy or sad." "We have news for you too," Anastasia said seriously, and Nick looked at her reproachfully. "Come on, tell us what's happened to you." "Well," laughed Rose, "you're going to be grandparents soon." "Really?" Anastasia came up to her daughter and hugged her. "I'm so happy. Nick, do you hear me?" She turned to her husband. "We're going to be grandparents. Will we have a grandson or granddaughter?" "I don't know," Rose shrugged. "We haven't had an ultrasound yet. It's scheduled for next week. Then we'll know the sex of the baby." "What's your news?" Nick looked pleadingly at Anastasia, and she answered with a wave of her hand. "It's nothing much. I'd forgotten about it." When Rose left, Nick approached his wife. "So we have lived to grandchildren." He put his arm around her shoulders. "You know, I was thinking about the fishing trips we used to take when Rose was a teenager. Why don't we go to the lake this weekend? I'll fish, and you can relax in the fresh air, buy some meat, barbecue." "Why?" Anastasia jumped at the idea. "All right, let's go. I'll make sandwiches, and we'll get some tea in a thermos," Anastasia said. "I want to wander around the grove near the lake and listen to the birds singing." "So we'll go on Saturday," said Nick. "I'll get my fishing rods ready. I think I saw them in the pantry. It's been a long time since I've been fishing." Nick was worried that Anastasia would change her mind about going with him. But on Saturday, she woke up early and got ready for the trip. When Nick came out of his room, she had everything ready, sandwiches and tea in a thermos. She even fried cutlets, boiled eggs, and sausages. Out in nature, you always work up an appetite. The fish have already waited for you, and you still sleep and sleep. She teased her husband. "We'll be left without a catch." "We won't." Nick grumbled good-naturedly and began to dress quickly. It took them about 40 minutes to get to the lake. All the way they were silent, there was nothing to talk about. While Nick was sorting out the rods and other gear, Anastasia spread a blanket on the grass, laid out the food, and called her husband to breakfast. They ate in silence, listening to the grasshoppers chirping and the bees buzzing nearby. I'm going fishing, Nick said, rising from the blanket and heading for the lake, while Anastasia put the groceries back in her bag. After standing beside her husband for a while, she walked toward the grove. How good it felt. She spread her arms. What grace. They walked back in silence, listening to music on the radio. "Shall I fry some fish?" Nick asked, satisfied. "I'll clean and fry it myself." "Where would I go?" replied Anastasia, getting out of the car. "We'll boil some more potatoes. We'll have a proper dinner." After dinner, Anastasia sat in her room watching TV. Suddenly she heard a phrase that made her think. Always give people a second chance, but never a third. Could it really be that Nick will change now, Anastasia thought. She walked over to the window. He's been courting me, even giving me flowers. And how can I tell my daughter about the divorce? Now, when she's expecting a baby. It's a shame to part with the apartment. So much work has gone into it. It's a lot of work, Anastasia thought. And what's to hide? I still love Nick, even though of course he doesn't deserve it. But as they say, love is evil, you'll fall in love. She moved away from the window and lay down on the bed. In the morning, entering the kitchen, Anastasia saw her husband standing at the stove, cooking something. "Oh, you're awake?" He was happy, sitting down at the table. "I fried some eggs. True, a little burned. If you want, I'll quickly make new ones." No, Anastasia waved her hands. "It's fine, it's even better." Nick sat down across from her. "How about you and I go to the movies or take a walk in the park? The last time we were there was about 5 or 6 years ago. Do you remember?" Yeah, Anastasia nodded. "You went on all the rides, even though you were hungover that day. And after you got out of the centrifuge, you fell on the grass and lay there for half an hour. I thought you were about to die. I even wanted to call an ambulance." "Yeah, I did," Nick grinned. "Oh, how much time I missed because of drinking. And how could you put up with me all this time?" "I was wondering the same thing." Anastasia got up from the table. "Why didn't you think of that before?" "I was a fool." Nick looked at her guiltily. "Listen, maybe you'll change your mind about the divorce. How many years have we been together? We'll be grandparents soon. What do we have to share? Old age is around the corner. It's better to face it together than alone. And I'll be lost without you." He sighed heavily. "I did not sleep all night today," All thought. "I love you, Anastasia. Believe it or not, I can't imagine life without you. Sure, I behaved like an asshole to you, but we had some good times when Rose was born, and I used to get up at night so you'd get some sleep. Remember when we used to redecorate and pick out wallpaper together?" Anastasia said. "Oddly enough, we liked the same ones. Do you remember when we went to the village for your niece's wedding? And you and I had no place to sleep because there were so many guests, so we climbed into the hayloft?" "Come on," she said indignantly. "You've got something to bring up. I decided to go shopping today, to look at the baby's dowry. Before you know it, he'll be born. So maybe I should come with you," Nick suggested with obvious reluctance. He didn't like shopping. "You should fix the faucet in the kitchen. And the shelf in the bathroom is about to fall down," Anastasia said, grabbed her bag and went out into the hallway. "I'll do it," Nick fussed. "Just hurry back." Anastasia walked down the street, shaking off the bright sun. Young mothers came across her, rolling strollers with sleeping babies in front of them. "Soon Rose will be strolling down the alley like that," she smiled. "And maybe I'll walk with the baby too, remembering how I used to walk with my daughter." She stopped to admire the little kids playing in the sandbox. They were so funny, they were enthusiastically making sandpits. "Roman, it's time to go home." She heard a man's voice nearby. "Let's go, or grandmother will scold." "Right away, Grandpa." A boy about 4 years old climbed out of the sandbox and headed toward a man standing not far from Anastasia. Grandpa? Grandma, she smiled, listening to the sound of those words. How time flies. It was only recently that we ourselves were running barefoot through the village, swimming in the pond, making plans for the future. And very soon I'll be a grandmother. Maybe Nick's right. We shouldn't get divorced, Anastasia wondered. He really would be lost without me. Nick hasn't been looking well lately. He's in pain, he won't tell me, but he keeps grabbing his right side, and he's been complaining of high blood pressure. I'd never forgive myself if something happened to him. I'll take my statement out of the courtroom tomorrow, Anastasia decided. But I won't tell Nick anything about it. Let him think I'm still determined. Maybe we really can have the human life I once dreamed of. She sighed with relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and strode lightly toward the children's store. And the next day in the evening, Rose and her husband Helium came to visit her mother and father and told them that a girl would be born, whom they decided to name Annie. Time passed, and Nick anxiously awaited the second summons. When he and Anastasia could be divorced for good, he didn't know that his wife had taken out a petition for dissolution of marriage, so there was nothing to fear. Anastasia, I've been thinking, he told his wife. Why don't we go on a vacation? You and I have never been anywhere together. And where will we get the money from? Anastasia looked at him in surprise. It's not cheap. Well, I've put some money aside. He pulled some money out of his pocket. I'll get my vacation money, and if I need it, I'll borrow it from someone. We'll go wild. I found out it's cheaper, and we can find a place to stay on the spot. Do you agree? I don't know, Anastasia said uncertainly. You should think about your health. You've been complaining about stomach aches and nausea lately. When we get back from vacation, I'll go to the doctor, Nick promised. Or maybe I just need a vacation, and then everything will be fine. Shall we go? Let's go, Anastasia waved her hand. We don't know when we'll get away next time. When my granddaughter is born, I won't have time to travel. I'll have to help my parents. That's great, rejoiced Nick. But I have a favor to ask you. He was silent for a while. Let's go on vacation by plane. I realize that it's expensive, but I'm embarrassed to admit. I've never been on an airplane, and I'd really like to try it, Nick said. I've only flown once, the year before last, and I'm afraid to go again. Anastasia looked at her husband with fear. Do not be afraid of anything, Nick reassured her. I will hold your hand the whole flight. At the airport, they were a little confused, not knowing which way to go, until they heard the announcer's voice inviting them to check in for their flight at counter number 4. Once seated, Nick immediately fastened his seatbelt and stared out the window, waiting for the plane to start moving. The flight was only supposed to last a couple hours, but Nick was gripped with panic from the first few minutes and his hands began to shake. He gripped the arms of the seat and closed his eyes. Feeling the plane begin to gain altitude, Nick opened one eye. He looked out the porthole and saw that they were flying above the clouds, and now he was overcome with a feeling of elation. The airplane had gained altitude. The passengers became animated, and some even began to unbuckle their seatbelts and get up from their seats to go to the restroom. Nick was still sitting in his seat, looking around curiously. The food arrived, and he was again surprised to find that the airplane had food. After lunch, he began to fall asleep. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. Nick woke up only when a pretty stewardess announced landing. The plane began to descend. Again, there was an amplified noise. Nick grabbed Anastasia's hand, who laughed. Well, who promised to hold whose hand? The plane landed safely, and Nick breathed a sigh of relief. It's a good thing we'll be traveling back by train. Nick and Anastasia settled in a private house in a room that barely fit the two of them. Every day they went to the beach, swimming in the warm sea, sunbathing on the hot sand, and in the evening they wandered the streets, listening to the music coming from the sidewalk cafes. Anastasia noticed that despite the vacation, her husband was somehow sad, and one day she asked him about it. You see, Anastasia, Nick replied. I've just realized that I've lived most of my life for nothing. I could have seen the whole world with you. But instead, I've prioritized the bottle, forgetting about everything in the world about you. I only cared about my drinking buddies, who were not really my friends at all. It's good that you realize that. Anastasia gently stroked her husband's arm. You and I have everything ahead of us now. We will work, save money for new trips. And maybe we'll buy a cottage? After all, when the granddaughter is born, she will need fresh air. Yeah, Nick seized on the idea. I'll build a gazebo, we'll drink tea and talk in the evenings. And we'll put a bathhouse and a swimming pool next to it. I've seen inflatable ones for sale at the store. Oh, we'll live with you. Just take this divorce papers with you. Or we'll have to remarry again. Hadn't you noticed that the deadline had passed and no summonses had come? Anastasia grinned. I thought you had figured it out a long time ago. Were you thinking about divorcing me? Nick jumped up happily from the bench, sighing and clutching his right side. That's it. When we get home, we'll go straight to the doctor. Anastasia helped her husband back to the bench. In case you have something serious, and the main thing is to start treatment in time. A couple of days later, they returned from vacation, and Anastasia made an appointment for her husband to see a general practitioner. An elderly man in a white coat listened to Nick attentively and gave him a referral for tests. On his second visit to the therapist, Nick received a referral for an ultrasound of the abdominal cavity and additional biochemical tests. Doctor, what do you think my husband has? Anastasia asked with concern. It's too early to say. The therapist scrutinized Nick's tests. But I can assume that your husband has cirrhosis, given his previous lifestyle, and the symptoms confirm it. Now you have to prepare for my funeral, Nick said irritably, when they left the clinic. Don't be sad for long, you're buried. Get married right away. Why should you live alone? Nick said with a bitter grin. Anastasia did not answer anything, understanding the mood of her husband. Coffin me, choose me inexpensive. There is nothing to spend, anyway we'll rot in the ground. And don't you dare dress me up in a suit. I can't stand these jackets and ties. Put me in a blue shirt and a gray sweater, my favorite. Then I'll look so handsome for sure. Stop talking nonsense. Anastasia couldn't take it anymore. Why are you burying yourself alive? We'll treat it as the doctor says. If necessary, we'll agree to surgery, and you'll be as good as new. And when the time comes, you'll die your own death. But that won't be for a while. Maybe I should go to church, do some penance. Nick suddenly suggested it. God will absolve me of my sins. Maybe I'll get better. How many sins do you have? Anastasia asked wryly. I think I know all your sins. Maybe you're hiding something else from me. I have one big sin, Nick lowered his head, but I can't tell you about it yet. I'll confess it when the time comes. Or maybe I'll take this secret with me to the grave. While they waited for the results of additional tests, Anastasia watched her husband. His appetite was gone, his sleep was disturbed, and he became nervous and irritable. As before, he was angry with his wife and dissatisfied with everything. Maybe I shouldn't have taken the application. Anastasia thought, we would have been divorced by now, and I wouldn't have heard those angry words. When it was time to go to the hospital again, Nick flatly refused. Go on your own, he said sharply to his wife. It was you who forced me to take stupid tests and examinations. I had nothing else to do. I had to go to the clinic alone. Anastasia knocked on the door and cautiously looked into the doctor's office. Ah, Titova recognized. Well, come in, said the doctor. I've come alone. Anastasia crossed the threshold. My husband isn't feeling well. Well, tell me how things are going. The doctor paced the room. "Perhaps it's better that you came alone," he said, stopping in front of Anastasia. "I have nothing to comfort you. The tests show that your husband has terminal liver cancer that has metastasized to other organs." "Is it incurable?" Anastasia asked the question and realized the stupidity of it. "Couldn't we do surgery or something else? Could chemotherapy be administered?" The doctor thought for a moment. "It could try. But I don't think it would help anymore. Although, you need to take some more tests to be sure that your body can withstand chemotherapy. Here's a referral to an oncologist for tests. He'll explain everything you need to do next." Anastasia walked home slowly, tears in her eyes and the doctor's voice in her ears, 3 to 6 months. When she returned, she walked into Nick's room and saw him sleeping with his legs tucked under him. Maybe it will still turn out okay, she watched her husband's face. As if he sensed her gaze, he opened his eyes. Seeing his wife, with difficulty he got up and sat down on the sofa. "How has he lost weight?" Anastasia thought. "Only recently we went to a resort. He looked good, even had a little tummy. Now it's so that all his clothes are hanging out." "What did your doctor say?" Nick asked with a grin. "You'll live," Anastasia answered hastily. "I just need to take some tests for treatment. We'll go with you tomorrow." "I'm not going anywhere," Nick shook his head. "I'll live as long as fate gives me. I don't need to poison my body with chemistry." How did he know about the chemo? Does he really know he has cancer? Anastasia was scared. "You'll get better if you follow the doctor's recommendations," she insisted. "You still have to get treatment." "I won't," Nick repeated capriciously. "Drink your own pills, maybe it's better for you. Maybe you'll become calmer and they'll let you go." "Become as you wish," Anastasia said tiredly. "I can't change your mind." The next day, Anastasia went to the oncologist and told him that her husband Nick didn't want to take any medication, and she hadn't even told him about the chemotherapy. "I'll tell you what the doctor said when asked if Nick had any chance of recovery. A lot in treatment depends on the patient himself, on his willpower and will to live. Sometimes hopelessly ill patients literally cling to life and live for another 10 years, and the other may die of a cold or cut his finger. If your husband does not want to fight, then medicine is powerless here. So just be close to your husband, help him, support him with painkillers, which I will now prescribe you. That's all you can do to help him." Once again, after leaving the hospital, Anastasia walked slowly down the street and couldn't believe that Nick might be leaving this world very soon. The phone rang and she saw on the display that it was her daughter calling. "Mommy, how are you and Daddy doing?" she asked cheerfully. "Helium and I want to come over and visit you today." "Oh, Rose, how can you show up?" Anastasia tried to answer. "Daddy's a little sick. Don't worry, it's nothing. He got a virus somewhere. I'm afraid I might catch it from him. When he gets better, we'll come to you. You need to take care now. You're about to give birth, so you mustn't get sick." Anastasia said goodbye to her daughter. She walked slowly down the street again. She didn't want to tell Rose that her father was seriously ill. When she had the baby, then she would know everything. In the meantime, let her remain in ignorance. Her husband's temper had changed for the worse again. He became cranky, angry, irritable again. When he was in pain, he would throw a pillow at Anastasia as if she were to blame for his suffering. Anastasia put up with his antics, making liquid porridge and spoon-feeding him. When he stopped rising from the couch, she massaged him to avoid bed sores and changed his underwear. Nick grew weaker every day. He could no longer turn over on his own. His speech became slow and at times slurred. He moaned and gritted his teeth in pain. And in his delirium, he kept saying, "Andrew, take me away, Andrew." 3 days before Nick died, Rose gave birth to a daughter, and Anastasia, sitting beside her husband, through her tears, said, Well, you've lived to see your granddaughter. Now get well. Annie needs a grandfather. You'll tell her stories and ride her on your back." But Nick didn't understand anything anymore. And just before he died, he looked at Anastasia with clear eyes and slowly said, "God punished me for Andrew. He was killed because of me. I should have been in his place." "What are you saying?" Anastasia screamed. But Nick didn't hear her anymore. After Nick's funeral, Anastasia was afraid to go into the empty apartment, where no one was waiting for her. In the evening, she wandered the streets for long periods of time, pondering her husband's last words, that her brother Andrew had died because of him. Now she would never know how it had really happened. And did she really need to know? After all, it had been so many years. On weekends, Anastasia visited her daughter and son-in-law to babysit Annie's granddaughter. Rose at first reproached her mother for hiding her father's illness from her. But Anastasia managed to convince her that pregnant women do not need negative emotions to bear a healthy child. After the death of her husband, life for Anastasia seemed to stop. Only her granddaughter, who had recently been born, gave her meaning. She blamed herself for once deciding to file for divorce from Nick. Maybe that was the reason for the rapid development of his illness due to mental distress. Although, as the doctor claimed, the development of the tumor began 2 years ago and was mostly asymptomatic. As time passed, the heartache gradually subsided, leaving only memories. Once Anastasia heard a song performed by a famous artist, and the words fell into her soul. "Before, I did not listen to my mother. I lived everything with my own mind. Everything seemed to know better. I stood my ground and satisfied with myself, quite everything Anastasia thought. I didn't believe that if my sweetheart said something to me, it meant it was all right. But it's true," she reflected. "I didn't listen to my mom once. She said I shouldn't marry Nick. I wouldn't be happy with him. I loved him dearly and thought that thanks to my love he would change and we would live well and long. Alas, that didn't happen. But I am sure that all good things are still ahead of me.